Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. It happened fast, no skid marks, no brake lights, no second chances. 1 minute he was jogging, same street, same hour, same quiet routine, and the next his body was laid out in the middle of Manchac Lane. A hit and run. That's what the report said. An accident maybe. Fog, poor visibility, wrong place, wrong time. But what if it wasn't? What if that black SUV didn't come out of nowhere, but followed a route it knew by heart? Just like Harold King. What if the timing wasn't unfortunate, but deliberate? Because Harold wasn't just any man. He was a former state senator, wealthy, respected, newly married. And less than a month after his death, his wife, Judge Amira Westfield, stood in a prison signing a marriage certificate with a convicted felon. A man no one knew she'd been visiting. A man her husband never even knew existed. So was Harold's death a random tragedy? Or was it part of a plan crafted by someone who understood timing, access, and silence? Someone who knew exactly when to act, and exactly what they'd gain once he was gone. Before the courthouse titles, before the black robes and courtroom applause, before she was Judge Westfield, she was just Amira Faye Westfield from Northside, Houston. She was born in 1990 in a one-bedroom duplex tucked behind a shuttered laundromat off Hardy Street. Her mother, Cynthia, worked nights as a CNA and days cleaning houses for families who never learned her name. There was no father around, never had been, and no one asked much about him. Amira used to tell people her dad lived out of state. The truth was, he lived 3 blocks over with another family and never once knocked on their door. Cynthia was hard, not cruel. She didn't believe in wasting time on dreams that didn't pay bills. But even as a little girl, Amira always had questions. Why some kids had 2 bedrooms and bikes with their names painted on them. Why her mother worked so much and still had notices taped to the door. Why the corner boys never got arrested. But her classmate's older brother went to jail for stealing cough syrup. She was the kind of child who listened more than she spoke. She studied people, watched for patterns, and even when she didn't understand the system, she knew there was one, and it wasn't built for girls like her. At school, she kept to herself straight A's, no nonsense. She was the one who always knew when a substitute was lying or when a teacher said something that didn't match what was in the textbook. She wasn't loud about it, just sharp. A quiet edge you didn't notice, until you were already bleeding from it. By 12, she had a paper route. By 15, she was tutoring seniors. She read Supreme Court cases on the back steps while other kids were sneaking out of detention. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being untouchable. Didn't come to her in one moment. There wasn't some courtroom drama on TV that lit a fire in her. It came in layers, watching her mother get pushed around by landlords, seeing neighbors arrested without cause, and noticing how fast-grown men stopped talking when she mentioned knowing her rights. The moment that stuck, though, the one she'd talk about later when people asked where it all started, was during her sophomore year. Her cousin Jameer got picked up in a stolen car he hadn't even been driving. The police called it proximity. They let the real driver walk because he gave them a fake name. Jameer spent 6 months in juvie. Amira read every line of his intake paperwork and wrote the judge a letter breaking down inconsistencies in the arrest report. She was 16. Nobody responded. But from then on, everyone around her knew Amira wasn't going to play by the rules. She was going to rewrite them. She got a full scholarship to Spelman, but turned it down to attend Howard University. Said she needed to be closer to the action, closer to DC, to the power, to the game. She graduated top of her class, skipped the usual post-law internships, and walked straight into the East Baton Rouge legal scene like she'd been born to sit behind a bench. She was 29 when they swore her in as the youngest criminal court judge in parish history. They called it history. She called it strategy, because Amira Westfield didn't just want a seat at the table. She wanted to build her own table and decide who got to sit across from her. But even as her name began echoing in courtrooms, behind her eyes was another world. One no headline ever mentioned. Amira had always lived 2 lives, one for the public, clean, strategic, powerful, and another quiet, guarded, full of things that could never be printed. Not every woman who rises is hiding something. But Amira had mastered the art of hiding everything. Harold Elijah King was the kind of man people called Sir, not out of obligation but out of habit. The kind of man who knew how to fill a room without raising his voice, who walked like time didn't rush him, and spoke like he'd already heard every version of the story before. He was born in 1952, in the thick heat of Plaquemine Parish. One of 10 children in a home where the walls sweated in July and the floor creaked with every step. And from a young age, Harold understood that if you wanted something in Louisiana, you had to speak it plain and work twice as hard to keep it. His father worked long days at the rail yard and long nights organizing union meetings that sometimes ended in whispers and warnings, and his mother kept the home together with fried catfish, gospel music, and the kind of silence that said more than shouting ever could. Harold learned to lead by watching his parents survive, by watching the people around him break, and by promising himself that he would never be at the mercy of another man's system. He went from student body president to councilman to senator in less than 2 decades, and for 30 years he served the state with a reputation that was clean, cautious, and calculated. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he got things done and kept his name out of scandal, which was more than most could say. He married Rosalind in 1979, stayed by her side through every diagnosis, every campaign, every sleepless night she spent waiting for him to come home from Baton Rouge, and when she passed in 2020, he disappeared quietly from the spotlight like someone had unplugged the stage lights and told the crowd to go home. For a year, Harold kept his head down, declined speaking engagements, sent checks to old causes, and showed up only at funerals and ribbon cuttings. But in early 2023, he started reappearing, sharper suits, smaller smiles, and the same steady presence that had once made headlines. And then in April, at a judicial fundraising gala at Hotel Montelion, Harold saw her. Amira Westfield walked in late, straight-backed, in a slate-gray dress that didn't ask for attention but demanded it anyway, and Harold, standing near the bourbon table, locked eyes with her once and never looked away again. They talked for nearly an hour that night, just the two of them, no cameras, no interruptions, just low conversation and high interest. And whatever was said between them was never shared, but what followed didn't need explanation. By June, he was sitting quietly at the back of her hearings, and by July, they were photographed together at a jazz benefit, her hand resting on his arm, his eyes looking at her like she was the last good thing the world had left. The age difference became the talk of Baton Rouge. Some called it inappropriate, others called it inspiring, but neither Harold nor Amira gave the press anything to chew on, and the headlines settled into a kind of Southern charm narrative. The elder statesman and the rising legal star, 2 legacies merging into one. They called it love. But what Harold didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Amira's heart had been spoken for long before she ever put on that dress or stepped into that ballroom. He wasn't her first, and he wouldn't be her last. He was the man who gave her everything, but he would never see what she gave away in return. Before Harold ever entered the picture, before the champagne galas and courthouse columns, before Baton Rouge labeled her a rising star, there was another man, one whose name never made the press, one who never saw daylight through glass without steel behind it, one who didn't need a microphone or a campaign to feel powerful because Damon Voss didn't play by the rules, and for some reason Amira never truly understood. That's exactly what drew her in. He was 39, serving a 9-year sentence at Dixon Correctional for fraud, forgery, and second-degree assault. Charges that stemmed from a complex web of bank schemes, fake real estate contracts, and a physical altercation that left a client bloodied and hospitalized after a deal went sideways. Amira met him back in 2017, during her time as a junior prosecutor assigned to a fraud-heavy docket. His case came across her desk like any other, one of dozens, but something about him made her look twice, not because he was innocent, but because he was convincing, articulate, calculated, and disturbingly self-aware. The kind of man who didn't just understand manipulation, but wore it like a second skin. In court, he called her ma'am with a smile, gave full eye contact, and never once asked for pity. Even as the evidence stacked against him, even as she secured the conviction that sent him away, he thanked her on record for her professionalism and walked out of the courtroom in cuffs like he already knew this wasn't the last time they'd speak. And he was right, because 2 years later, Amira received the first letter. It was short, handwritten, no return address beyond the prison's facility code, and filled with compliments that sounded less like praise and more like permission, as if he already sensed the 2 lives she was living and had no intention of judging her for either. She didn't reply at first, but she kept the letter. And then, sometime in late 2022, the letters resumed, more frequent, more personal, no begging, no romance, just recognition. 2 sharp minds dancing around each other on paper, talking about justice and control, about power and weakness, and about the difference between being feared and being remembered. By early 2023, Amira was making private visitations under the guise of prison reform advocacy. Dressed in her work blazers, cleared under her judicial credentials, sitting across from Damon Voss in a booth meant for family, speaking in tones low enough for the guards to ignore. There were no photos, no files, no paper trail, just a woman with keys to the courtroom and a man who had nothing left to lose, except his influence over her, which only seemed to grow stronger. He became the thrill she had never known she needed, the sharp edge that reminded her she wasn't just respected, she was watched. And when he leaned in across that plastic table and said, "Let him give you what you need, the name, the firm, the access. Then we write our own ending." She didn't flinch, didn't question, didn't blink, because somewhere deep down, that ending had already been outlined in her mind, long before the question was even asked. So when Harold King knelt down in his garden one chilly evening in October 2023 and asked Amira to be his wife, she smiled, nodded, and offered only one condition. He would fund her dream legal consultancy, fully in her name, with full autonomy over location, branding, hiring, and private contract rights. If you've been watching this story unfold, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, city, state, or country. Your voice matters here. Let's see how far this story is reaching. In January 2024, just days into the new year, Amira told Harold she didn't want a big wedding, said she couldn't afford to be in the press for too long, said judicial ethics required her to limit how public her personal life became, said she didn't want cameras or receptions or speeches, only him, only a quiet vow, a quiet room, and a quiet start to the life she had earned. And Harold, always the gentleman, agreed without pushing back because when Amira asked for something, didn't ask twice. They chose July 20th as the date, a Saturday private courthouse vows, a small dinner in the garden behind Harold's estate. In February, Harold signed the new business transfer forms. He added Amira's name to the 2 properties he kept downtown. He filed the co-ownership documents on her behalf. He funded a trust worth $400,000 tied directly to her consultancy firm, Westfield Mediation and Legal Affairs, calling it a gift for her independence. Telling her, this way, you'll never need permission from anyone again. By March, they had set up a joint financial account. By April, her name appeared on investment summaries. By May, contractors finalized the security system layout for her new office. And by June, while Harold was still picking floral arrangements for the backyard ceremony, Damon Voss was allegedly using an encrypted signal to reach out to a man from his past, a former cellmate named Jalen Crowley, now working out of a body shop in Slittle. A man with priors. The kind of man who didn't ask many questions when money showed up fast, as long as no names were involved. A crypto payment of exactly $14,000 was transferred to a digital wallet linked to Jalen's old burner account. The IP address logged during the transfer originated from a secure line once connected to Amira's law office server, a server she claimed hadn't been used since renovations began. There was no digital trail leading directly to Damon. No phone call, no video, no signature. They got married on a Saturday afternoon, July 20th, 2024, under a white tent in the Harold's home on Ridgeway Drive, just past the garden where Rosalind used to plant morning glories and keep a rocking chair that hadn't moved since her funeral. The guest list was small by design. A handful of retired judges, 2 city council members, Harold's pastor from St. Mark Baptist, Amira's court clerk, and 1 local journalist who wasn't allowed to ask questions, only take photos. There were no bridesmaids, no band, no cake cutting, no bouquet toss. Just chairs and rows, linen pressed, and heat that made the air feel heavier than the silence between Harold's grown children. Amira wore ivory sleek, no lace, no veil, hair pinned back like she was headed to a hearing. No visible jewelry except the diamond on her left hand, and a thin gold bracelet that caught the sun whenever she shifted. Her smile was practiced, her steps measured. She walked down the aisle alone. Harold waited for her at the front, charcoal suit, cane in his left hand, tucked just slightly behind his leg to keep from showing. He didn't look weak, just older, like the years were beginning to settle into his bones. The vows were short. He called her his second chapter. She called him the foundation she never had. They didn't say, "Till death do us part," just as long as we are given. People clapped politely, a few smiled. Behind the applause were eyes that watched too closely. His daughter, Tasha, didn't stand during the toast. His son, Marcus, stepped away twice to answer fake phone calls. There were no speeches from friends, no stories about how they met, just quiet congratulations, tight hugs, and a dinner that ended before sunset. Amira barely ate. She moved from table to table, like someone fulfilling a checklist. Harold introduced her to each guest, like she was the beginning of something new. And she nodded, like she already knew how it would end. That night they didn't fly anywhere. No honeymoon. No trip. Harold said he wanted to stay close, just in case court called. But in truth, Amira had already requested the following Monday off. Not because of romance, but because final papers for the second phase of her law firm were being delivered that morning. By Tuesday she was back in court. By Thursday, her new receptionist started orientation. And by the end of the week, Harold had quietly transferred the final portion of the Westfield Trust into an account bearing her signature alone. What looked like a new beginning on paper was already being measured in deadlines. Because for Harold, this was a promise. But for Amira, it was a transaction already paid for in full. And the return on that investment was coming sooner than anyone realized. At exactly 5:46 a.m. on August 21st, 2024, Harold King turned onto Manchac Lane like he always did, wearing his gray jogging hoodie. The one with the old campaign logo faded across the back, headphones in, left foot dragging just slightly from that old knee injury he never fixed because he never liked doctors. And with no driver, no security, no companions, he moved at the same pace he always did. Slow, steady. Always between the curb and the tree line where he liked to watch the sun come up through the Spanish moss hanging low over the road. And as he passed the house with the chipped white shutters and the cracked birdbath near the sidewalk, he had exactly 4 minutes left to live. What happened next didn't make a sound loud enough to wake the block. No one called out. No dogs barked. No motion sensors triggered. But 2 neighbors later recalled hearing a single thud, quick, deep, dull, like a dumpster lid closing hard or a heavy branch snapping underweight. And by the time the first car drove past at 6:08 a.m., Harold King was no longer breathing. He was found lying flat, face turned slightly toward the trees. Both arms bent unnaturally under him, his jaw fractured, ribs crushed, left leg broken at the knee, and one of his shoes had flown nearly 40 feet into the gutter on the opposite side of the street, while the other had twisted off at the ankle, toe still warm when paramedics arrived. The black SUV, no make, no model, no plates, had come and gone in less than 5 seconds, striking Harold so cleanly and directly that the investigators would later note there was almost no blood on the road, just on his collar, on his wrist, and on the jagged seam where the back of his head had hit the edge of the concrete. There were no witnesses, no dash cams, no cameras on that stretch of road. The closest house with a Ring doorbell had its battery removed for weeks. The fog that morning hung just low enough to blur the outline of anything beyond 20 feet, and the corner of Manchac where he was hit had no traffic signs, no school zone, no posted limit, just a blind curve and a history of silence. The 911 call came from a woman walking her dog, a nurse on her way home from the overnight shift, and she said she thought it was a pile of clothes at first. Then she saw the leg, then she dropped the leash and started screaming, and when responders arrived at 617, the only thing they could do was pronounce him dead on the scene and begin taping off a space that would never give them anything back. His iPod was still playing, volume up, still spinning a coal train track on loop, the wire tangled under his arm, battery dying slowly as the sun began to rise. His wedding ring, polished gold, was still on his left hand, pressed against the cold asphalt. Back at the house, Amira was still asleep, according to the driver who was scheduled to take her to court by 8:15. He rang the bell at 7:02, no answer. Called twice, went to voicemail. By the time she finally stepped out at 7:44, hair tied back, black wrap coat on, she looked up and saw the flashing lights down the block. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood still. She asked one question. "Is it him?" And when the officer nodded, she closed her eyes, lowered her head, and said nothing. News broke by 9 a.m. retired Louisiana Senator Harold King killed in tragic hit and run. By 10:15, photos of him smiling in front of the Capitol were circulating on every major local station. By 11 o'clock, the mayor issued a statement calling him an irreplaceable pillar of public life. At exactly 12:03 p.m., Amira stood behind a podium outside the East Baton Rouge courthouse, flanked by 2 aides, one hand resting flat on the top, her voice even as she read her prepared statement, calling Harold, a man whose life was service, saying she had lost her compass, her partner, and the only person who had ever seen her for who she truly was. She didn't cry. She didn't take questions. She stepped away, entered the black car waiting at the curb, and disappeared behind tinted windows. But as the cameras turned away, as the flowers began to pile up near the scene of the crash, one thing stood out to the investigators who quietly walked that block again and again for 3 days straight. There was no debris, no paint, no rubber, no sign that the car had ever hit its brakes, no indication that Harold King's death was a mistake, just an old man on a predictable path, and someone who knew exactly where to be to make sure he never finished it. 6 hours after Harold King was declared dead, Amira Westfield was filmed walking out of the East Baton Rouge coroner's office. Dressed in solid black from neck to ankle, dark sunglasses covering her eyes, her hair pinned back into the same tight bun she wore for sentencing hearings, her heels steady on the concrete, her shoulders squared like she was headed into an argument she had already prepared for, and as cameras clicked and local reporters tried calling her name, she said nothing gave. No sign of emotion, no visible strain, no pause, not even when one reporter asked directly, "Judge Westfield, how are you holding up?" She simply kept walking, hands folded in front of her, not touching the walls or reaching for help. And when she stepped into the waiting car, she didn't slam the door or rush to hide. She just closed it softly behind her, as if there was nothing left to say. That footage ran on the evening news that night, just a 6-second clip with no sound, and it played beside images of Harold from his Senate days. Smiling in parades, cutting ribbons, giving speeches, and the voiceover called him a pillar of public trust, while the screen never showed Amira's face, only the outline of her leaving the building, disappearing into the black SUV with tinted windows and no plates. But what the footage didn't show, what no camera captured, was the message Amira had received just days before the wedding, scribbled in blue ink across a sheet of torn notebook paper. A letter she never showed anyone. A letter she read alone in her office late one night before switching off the lights and whispering something under her breath she never repeated again. It read, "I told you we'd find a way. You just had to believe. Let him hand you the keys. Let him fund the dream. Let the world see you become what they never expected. Then we disappear. Me, you, and everything we were supposed to have before they locked me away." It was signed only D. That letter was never found in her home, but a copy of it was discovered months later. Shredded and taped back together by investigators combing through Damon Vass's outgoing prison mail logs. Meanwhile, back on Manchac Lane, investigators worked quietly through the morning and into the next day, searching for footage, tire fragments, any surveillance angle from nearby homes or businesses, but nothing surfaced, and by 36 hours in, the lead detective made the call that no one wanted to put on paper but knew had to be made. The accident was likely caused by a vehicle coming around the blind curve too fast. Unable to see Harold through the fog. Likely never saw him until it was too late. Likely panicked, didn't stop, maybe didn't even know what they hit. Maybe just kept going out of fear and with no witnesses, no brake marks, and no footage to contradict that. The official cause was listed as vehicular fatality due to limited visibility and road curvature. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't foul play. It was a tragic accident. That's what the report said. That's what the coroner signed off on. That's what the city told its people. But behind closed doors, the officers who had worked Harold's security details in years past were already whispering, already asking quiet questions to one another in the hallway, already wondering why a man with his instincts, his discipline, his routine, and his decades in public life hadn't taken the guarded trail just 2 blocks over. The trail he usually used when visibility was low, the one he skipped only once in recent memory, and that was the morning he died. Back at the house, Amira took phone calls from the governor, the state bar president, and the head of the Judicial Ethics Committee. She thanked them. She gave calm updates. She declined all interviews. She canceled the small memorial originally planned for the courthouse steps and replaced it with a private funeral scheduled for the following Tuesday at Glenview Cemetery, where Harold's family had already reserved a plot next to his late wife, Rosalind, a move that felt sudden to some, but was explained as prearranged by Amira's office before anyone thought to question it. She didn't ask for help with arrangements. She didn't cry in public. She didn't lean on anyone. And when she did speak, finally, 1 week after Harold's death, during a short eulogy in front of 27 guests, she read from a folded piece of paper and said, "He was kind to me when he didn't have to be. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And he gave me something no one else could. Space to become something bigger than I'd ever imagined." Then she paused, closed the paper, and walked away from the microphone without waiting for applause or comfort. But what most didn't see, and what none of them could have known, was that the morning after the funeral, Amira Westfield submitted a sealed request to take a 2-week leave from court citing emotional recovery. And on that same day, her driver logged a trip to St. Francis Correctional, 2 hours northeast, at 8 to 12 a.m. No one thought to ask why, and even if they had, they wouldn't have believed the answer. Marcus Elijah King was the kind of man who never made noise unless he had proof, the type who let facts do the talking and left emotions behind the firewall. And when his father died, he didn't shout at the memorial, didn't throw accusations, didn't challenge a mirror in front of anyone. He just stood at the back in a dark suit, arms crossed, watching, processing. He was 38, a software analyst based out of Dallas, used to combing through thousands of lines of data, spotting what didn't belong, finding what others missed. And 2 weeks after the funeral, when he was handed the first round of property documents to begin probate for Harold's estate, he didn't expect anything unusual, only paperwork, titles, deeds, ledgers, bank statements. But on the second day of reviewing his father's downtown commercial leases, Marcus saw something that didn't make sense. One of the properties, an office suite near 6th and Beauregard that Harold had owned outright since 2009, now listed a second name on the lease. Not Amira, not a law partner, but Damon Voss. The name was typed cleanly into the amended lease under secondary business affiliate, with no explanation, no signature from Harold, no legal cosigner attached. At first, Marcus assumed it was a clerical error, maybe a mistake from the real estate office, maybe someone copy-pasted the wrong file. But when he pulled the corresponding bank record to double-check the monthly deposit attached to that address, what he saw made his stomach tighten. $92,300 had been wired from Harold's private investment account to a company called Foodcore Industries, registered in a Louisiana district known mostly for trucking warehouses and processing plants, a company that Marcus had never heard of. He ran the name through his internal tools. Within minutes, he found it was linked to a state-registered food contractor currently supplying items to correctional facilities across 2 parishes. And the account number the funds were wired to had previously appeared in a flagged fraud case involving inmate commissary laundering. That wasn't all. As he kept digging, he came across a scanned power of attorney form dated July 5, 2024, 2 weeks before the wedding. The document was clean, properly filed, witnessed by Amira's legal aid, notarized by a name Marcus didn't recognize, and most importantly, it listed Amira as sole beneficiary, sole medical proxy, and co-signer on all Harold's liquid assets, with no mention of Harold's children anywhere in the addendum. The signature on the form matched Harold's, but something about it felt too smooth. Marcus remembered his father's handwriting from birthday cards, angular, slow, deliberate. This one looked fast, almost like a trace. Still, without proof of forgery, it stood. So Marcus turned to the prenup. He remembered hearing his father mention it over the phone once in late June, right after the engagement went public. Harold had said he was drawing something up with his attorney to keep things clean. But when Marcus searched Harold's home office, the file cabinet where his father kept every contract from the last 20 years, including divorce settlements from tenants he'd never even met, had no folder marked prenuptial, no draft copy, no PDF printout, nothing. Just a gap between files, a missing label, as if the document had never existed at all. When Marcus asked Harold's longtime legal advisor, the man said they'd discussed and never finalized it. When he asked Amira's assistant, she said, "I wasn't involved." When he asked Amira herself, she smiled and said, "Your father didn't want one. He said I was family." That was the moment Marcus knew something was wrong. Not just emotionally, not just suspicious, but systematically, intentionally wrong. Because Harold King didn't make moves without a trail. And now his steps had vanished, replaced by someone else's name. Someone who shouldn't have been in the picture at all. At the memorial for Harold's firm, where flowers sat neatly under framed awards and guests whispered their respects into linen napkins, Marcus approached Amira with calm precision, his tone respectful, but his eyes unmoved, asking questions about the lease, the wire transfer, the missing prenup. But instead of answering, she tilted her head slightly and said, "Marcus, I know you're hurting, but this isn't how we heal." Then smiled like nothing had been said and walked away without giving him a name, a document, or even the decency of a pause. She moved through the room like someone putting on a play they'd already rehearsed, shaking hands with donors, standing for photos and answering polite questions about her firm's future. And the longer Marcus watched, the more certain he became. She didn't mourn like a widow. She moved like a woman covering her tracks. In Atlanta, Tasha King had been quiet, watching from a distance, staying off social media, staying away from courthouse steps and family drama. But when Marcus sent her what he found, documents with Vass's name, deleted draft folder, the power of attorney change, Tasha didn't need convincing. She called the East Baton Rouge clerk's office and asked directly if there had been any marriage license filings for Judge Amira Westfield since August. And after being placed on hold, the clerk came back with something she wasn't expecting, a sealed certificate, notarized and filed, marked confidential but visible in the system. The name of the groom was Damon Germain Voss, and the date of marriage was September 18, 2024. 28 days after Harold's death, executed inside Angola Correctional Facility. Tasha didn't speak for almost a minute after hearing it, then asked the clerk to repeat it twice, wrote it down, and called Marcus. She didn't cry, didn't break, didn't yell. She said she married someone else, while we were still writing the obituary. In prison, Marcus didn't interrupt. He was already opening his laptop, already confirming the clerk's entry, already connecting the final dot in a picture that no longer looked like coincidence. But what neither of them saw coming hit the internet like a quiet explosion 3 days later. A blurry photo posted to a small Louisiana prison reform blog, showing Amira standing inside Angela's visitation hall in a black blazer and court slacks, her left hand resting softly on her stomach. She was clearly pregnant, her face tilted towards someone off frame, and she was smiling. The photo came with no caption, just a line about a judge recently seen entering Angola twice last week, and within hours, it began circulating through Baton Rouge law offices and court group chats. No one saying her name publicly, but everyone connecting the dots. One anonymous commenter on the blog claimed to work reception at the facility, and said the woman had arrived with sealed credentials, bypassed standard intake, met with only one inmate, and never gave her name aloud. By Monday, 3 court clerks had already seen the image. Were texting the same thing in different ways. She's pregnant. That's her. And she married him. What once looked like sorrow now looked like strategy. And what the city had framed as a sudden, tragic loss was now being reframed in private circles as something else. Something planned, executed, and hidden behind a grieving widow's face. Marcus and Tasha met that Friday in Baton Rouge. They didn't argue. They didn't speculate. They agreed on one thing. This wasn't just a story. This was evidence. And they were going to find out exactly what role Amira played in every step that led from a jog on Manchac Lane to a sealed marriage license behind concrete walls. The time for waiting was over. It was time to follow what Harold left behind and uncover everything he didn't know. What will you do if you found out that your father's death wasn't an accident? On the morning of October 9, 2024, Judge Amira Westfield arrived at her chambers just after 7:45 a.m. dressed in navy, hair tied back, briefcase in hand, no sign of hesitation as she stepped through the courthouse security checkpoint and greeted the bailiff by name. But what she didn't know, or maybe what she already expected, was that 2 plainclothes detectives from the district attorney's office were waiting in her chambers, badges visible, a sealed warrant in hand, and within minutes, she was being read her rights with the same calm tone she had once used herself from the bench. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for clarification. She nodded, asked to call her attorney, and was escorted down a side hallway to avoid cameras. There was no struggle, no press alert, just a quiet end to the illusion of control. She was charged with 3 counts: conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice, and judicial misconduct. The murder charge never came. Not because there wasn't suspicion, not because there weren't theories, but because there was nothing solid left to hold. No weapon, no suspect, and no one alive to testify. The man who was allegedly paid to kill Harold King had been found shot, execution style, in a burned car 3 weeks after the incident, body unrecognizable except for a partial tattoo and a fingerprint pulled from a melted lighter. And by the time investigators connected him to a crypto wallet tied to a burner device linked to Amira's firm, it was too late. The only person who could have pointed to Amira, or to Damon, was already in the ground. The trial began in December 2024. Cold air. Tight security. No press allowed inside the courtroom. The seating was limited. Family was separated. Jurors were vetted with extra scrutiny. No one wanted this case to turn into a media circus. But even the walls seemed to hold tension as Amira sat quietly at the defense table in a black dress. No jewelry. No eye contact with the gallery. Her hands clasped like someone in prayer, but her face unmoved. Damon Voss, now her legal husband, pleaded guilty to financial conspiracy and asset laundering. He admitted to instructing third parties to move funds through shell accounts, acknowledged his role in creating false corporate identities, and confirmed that he had maintained contact with Amira before and after Harold's death. But when asked to testify against her, he declined. He didn't say a word on the record about her involvement. The prosecution couldn't compel him, so the burden fell on the evidence. The state's case didn't try to tell the jury how Harold King died. Instead, they told them what happened after. They outlined a precise sequence of events. Harold's trust being transferred into Amira's firm days before the wedding. The crypto payment originating from a masked IP inside her office. The lease naming Damon on a property Harold never approved. And the sealed marriage license filed less than a month after the funeral. They showed text logs recovered from Damon's prison account, including one that read, "She's making the move this summer. Be ready." They connected the pregnancy timeline to the estimated date of conception. They introduced court filings showing Amira had requested private visitation access months before Harold's death. They played a timeline that didn't rely on blood or bullets, just patterns, paper, and silence. Amira's defense team responded with a narrative of loss and manipulation. They called her a grieving woman coerced by a man who knew how to exploit her, who preyed on her loneliness, who offered her affection in the darkest moments of her career. They pointed to Damon's criminal history, his manipulation of past victims, and they claimed Amira had been used legally, emotionally, financially. They said Harold King was a controlling man, that Amira had confided in close colleagues about his possessiveness, that she had never meant to fall in love with Damon, that she had simply made a series of emotional decisions that blurred the line between bad judgment and criminal intent. They never denied the documents. They never claimed the money hadn't moved. They simply argued that she wasn't behind it, that she was trying to escape from two men, not use them. The courtroom stayed quiet through most of the testimony. Jurors watched her closely. Some leaned forward when the prosecution showed footage of Amira entering Angola, the same week her court calendar claimed she was attending a judicial retreat. Others stiffened when Damon's financial transfers aligned exactly with Harold's unexplained withdrawals. But Amira never took the stand. Her lawyers said it would do more harm than good. And so the case ended without her voice. 4 days of deliberation, and then the verdict came down. She was found guilty, but not of murder, not manslaughter. Judge Amira Westfield was convicted of obstruction of justice and financial misconduct. The court cited her previous contributions to the legal community, her lack of violent history, and the absence of direct evidence tying her to Harold's death as reasons for sentencing leniency. Damon was sentenced to 9 additional years. Amira was given 18 months in a minimum security correctional facility with eligibility for parole and 9. She didn't flinch when it was read. She looked down, blinked once, and exhaled softly, as if the chapter had already ended before anyone else turned the page. Outside, it didn't take long. News broke within minutes. Headlines flooded timelines before she even left the courthouse steps. Pregnant judge walks after financial conspiracy conviction. She married the felon and buried the senator. No murder charges filed. No justice for Harold King. Cable news lit up across the state. National pundits grabbed hold within the hour. One anchor in New Orleans put it bluntly. She gave a man's empire to a felon and walked out with a baby bump and $2 million in clean assets. Another asked if Harold King had been a janitor. Would she be free today? Social media exploded. The words rigged, elite, protected, and sham trended locally for the next 48 hours. Courtroom sketches of Amira were reposted over 10,000 times. One video clip showing her calmly exiting the courthouse while protesters chanted her name became the banner image for the week's debate on legal double standards. At a candlelight vigil held 2 nights later outside Harold King's law firm, his daughter Tasha stood in front of a small crowd with a trembling voice and said, "My daddy was betrayed by love and by law. We buried him twice. Once in a coffin, once in court." Her hands shook as she held the photo of her father at his retirement ceremony, the one where he stood smiling with both arms around his children, unaware that less than 2 years later, the woman beside him in the front row would sign away everything he'd built. The district attorney issued a statement the next day, acknowledging the public's frustration, but reiterating the legal limitation. There was no direct evidence linking Judge Westfield to the fatal act, and without that, we must operate within what the law allows. Legal scholars debated the strength of circumstantial evidence for days. Some argued the case should have been handled federally. Others claimed the sentence was appropriate given the charges, but the public had made up its mind. They didn't want paperwork. They wanted accountability. Meanwhile, Damon Voss remained in custody at Angola, serving out the remainder of his original sentence, plus an additional 9 years for financial conspiracy. But even behind bars, his name refused to fade. Weeks after Amira's sentencing, new allegations surfaced linking Damon to a Louisiana developer already under investigation for campaign finance violations and property fraud. Investigators began tracing shell transfers from a Baton Rouge construction fund to the same holding company that had previously received wire payments from Harold King's account. The district attorney reopened an internal probe. More names surfaced. More questions followed. And while that unfolded, Amira quietly entered her facility in Oakwood Parish without media presence. Her intake photo taken at 3:22 p.m. Her pregnancy confirmed by facility medical staff. Her housing arranged in a private low-risk unit due to her high-profile status. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't appeal the sentence. She simply went in without apology, without confession, and without a single visible sign that the weight of what had happened ever touched her at all. Harold lost his life, his estate, his name, and the final years he thought he would spend watching his children grow into leaders, not witnesses. Damon lost the one chance he had to move freely again, locked down with new charges before he could even finish what he started. And Amira, the woman at the center of it all, walked out 9 months later. Same last name, different address, no formal disbarment hearing, and nothing in the record that ever truly answered the question everyone kept asking. How much did she plan? And how much did she simply allow to happen? Because when you look at the timeline, it's all too clean. The trust established just before the wedding. The shell company with ties to a prison supplier. The power of attorney quietly filed and notarized. The wiped draft of a prenup no one could find. The sealed marriage to a man still serving time. The baby, timed to a due date that placed conception squarely before Harold's death. The wire transfers. The deleted logs. The silence. If the system taught her how to lie, did she really break it? Just play it better than they expected. She knew the rules. She sat on the bench where others begged for mercy. She signed warrants. She wrote decisions. And in the end, she used that knowledge not to protect justice, but to escape it. So the question now isn't whether Amira Westfield was guilty. The court answered that. The question is guilty of what? Was she a widow who got swept into the arms of a manipulator? Or was she the architect? Quiet, precise, deliberate. And if she was both, what to do with that? Because justice isn't always about the law. Sometimes it's about what people carry when the verdict is read. Tasha carries silence now, refusing all interviews, refusing to say her name. Marcus moved to Oregon last spring, never once mentioning the case again to the press. The firm Harold built sits empty, its sign removed, the doors locked. So now we leave you with this. What would justice have looked like for Harold? For Damon? For Amira? And for the child born in the middle of it all? And if this had been someone you loved, your father, your sister, your friend, would you call it closure? Or just the final move in a game nobody really won? If someone you loved was killed, and their spouse married a felon within weeks, would you believe it was grief? Or greed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to this channel, where truth isn't always black and white. And before you click away, ask yourself what you'd do if the same hand that wore a wedding ring over your father's was the same one that quietly signed the paperwork that moved everything he owned to another man's name. Ask yourself how you'd feel if a judge, a woman sworn to defend the law, stood in court and said she was a victim, while the evidence showed a timeline that was far too precise to be coincidence. Ask yourself how many times you've seen people like Amira walk away, while families like the Kings are left with answers that don't answer anything. Think about the headlines. Think about how fast the story changed. A senator's death became a footnote. A prison wedding became gossip. And a woman who once sentenced others was allowed to rewrite her own. If this was your family, would you be able to forgive what the court called leniency? Or would it feel like a second burial? Would you believe the tears she never cried? The pregnancy she never disclosed? The name she gave that child? If justice is measured by outcomes and not intentions, did she lose anything at all? Or did she walk away with everything she came for? Reputation shifted, estate acquired, baby in her arms, and nothing left to prove? We're not here to tell you what to believe. We're here to show you what happened, and to let you sit with what wasn't said in the courtroom. Because grief moves quietly, but so does greed. Story 2. 2 shots. The first was clean, quick, decisive. It ended everything. The second was softer, quieter, almost like the world was holding its breath before it let go. In the stillness that followed, there was no sound but the echo of those shots, ringing in the night. But it wasn't the gun that broke him. It was the silence, the unbearable weight of betrayal. Because when the woman you loved, when the woman you buried walks into your life again, the world doesn't just break, it shatters. And Jamal, the man who thought he had lost everything, would never be the same again. Before the silence, before the burned-out car and the questions left behind, there was a man named Jamal C. Braddock. And he had dreams once, real ones, the kind that don't start with fame or end with revenge. Just a quiet life built from steady things. Books, students, family, and a name he was proud to pass down. He was 33, living in Decatur, Georgia, working as an AP English teacher at the local high school, where he taught kids how to find their voice in poetry and how to survive a system that rarely gave them room to breathe. And when he walked into class each morning, shoulders square and tie slightly crooked, he told them, "You're the author of your next chapter." And they believed him because he didn't just say it, he lived it. Jamal wasn't loud, but he was present. Passionate, grounded, thoughtful. The kind of man who carried a journal in his back pocket and wrote lines he never showed anyone. And when he wasn't in the classroom, he was at home with his daughter Zora, who asked more questions than any adult he knew and wore his old Clark Atlanta sweatshirt like it was armor. And then there was Mia Lorraine Braddock, 31, former Marine, now a trauma nurse at Grady, sharp with her words but soft with her hands. The kind of woman who didn't beg for respect because she walked in it, who handled pressure like it was oxygen, and still came home with just enough strength left to hold her family together on the days Jamal couldn't find the words. They met in college junior year. He was on the library steps performing spoken word about justice and heartbreak, and she was passing through with a group of friends, rolled her eyes mid-verse, said, "You sound like a Hallmark card," and kept walking. But he followed her anyway, asked her out 3 times before she said yes. And the night she finally agreed, she told him, "Don't fall in love with my story if you're not ready for the plot twist." And somehow, that made him love her more. They struggled early, bounced between small apartments, scraped through bills, raised Zora on late nights and microwave dinners. But they built something that held even when life shook the walls. Something forged in arguments and apologies and quiet dances in the kitchen when the lights were low and no one was watching. Jamal didn't just love Mia, he trusted her, leaned on her, wrapped his future around her voice. And when Zora came, he promised he'd be the kind of man she'd want to marry someday. The kind who shows up, stays soft, and never lies. And he kept that promise the best he could until everything fell apart. And then there was Deshaun Porter, the kind of friend who didn't knock when he came over because the door had always been open to him. The one Jamal grew up with in Macon, 3rd grade to grown men, who'd shared bikes, sneakers, and secrets, who once stood on a cracked sidewalk and said, "Blood don't always come from blood." And Jamal had believed him, because they'd been through things only brothers would understand. Deshaun was rough around the edges, couldn't hold a job for long, worked construction when he could, drank a little too much on weekends, and showed up to holidays half broke, but never empty-handed. He called Zora Shorty, called Mia Queen, and always left the party last, claiming he didn't like to say goodbye. Jamal had his rhythm, school, home, poetry nights when Mia could watch Zora, late-night grading sessions with music low. And even though money was tight and exhaustion came easy, there was peace in the way things were, a quiet rhythm that made sense. But peace has a price. And sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who start counting. While Jamal was writing lesson plans and Mia was stitching up strangers in trauma bays, while Zora was drawing family portraits with stick figures and crooked hearts, while life kept marching forward like it always had, something else began to shift beneath the surface, quiet and steady. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with a warning. It walks in wearing old shoes and calling your mother Ma, and when it finally happens, you don't hear it coming. You just feel the floor vanish under your feet. Jamal didn't know it then, but the people he trusted most had already begun rewriting his story without him. And soon, the man who taught others to own their narrative would find himself living in one he didn't recognize. She left on a Friday, clear skies, calm water, no hesitation in her voice. It wasn't unusual. Mia had always believed in solitude as medicine. After back-to-back overnight shifts, she'd say she needed to reset, to breathe, to be still without someone tugging on her scrubs or calling her name. So when she booked a solo boating retreat up at Lake Hartwell, no one questioned it. She packed light, a small overnight bag, a journal, 1 pair of sneakers, and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a day with no interruptions. Before she pulled away, she kissed Zora on the forehead, lingered in the doorway like she always did when she didn't want to leave, and told Jamal, "See you Sunday, baby. Kiss Zora for me." Then she smiled, climbed into the car. And that was the last time they saw her. Saturday morning, the call came from the sheriff's office. A fishing guide had found a rental boat, drifting near the dam, empty. The keys were still in the ignition, the throttle set to idle. Inside a denim jacket, her purse with her ID and credit cards untouched, and a sealed envelope labeled "Just in case Mia." They found her life jacket tangled near the rocks. No blood, no struggle, no body. Just silence. Local authorities launched the search by midday. Word had spread fast. Missing woman. Rental boat adrift. No signs of life. The ranger on duty called it in just after 10 a.m., and by noon, Lake Hartwell looked like a scene from a disaster drill. Sheriff's deputies set up base along the edge of the marina. Red and blue lights flashed against the trees while news vans began rolling in. A perimeter was marked off. Curious locals gathered behind yellow tape. Search and rescue teams brought in 3 boats with sonar imaging. They moved slowly, side by side, scanning beneath the surface like they were peeling back layers of earth. The lake, usually calm and used for fishing, felt different that day. Heavier, as if it was hiding something it didn't want to give back. Helicopters arrived just after 2. They hovered in wide circles, low enough to rattle the tree line, high enough to keep distance from the boats. Through the thick summer air, their blades cut an unnatural rhythm. Ominous, endless. From the sky, the shoreline was jagged and uneven. Pockets of thick brush, drop-offs, shallow banks that led into deeper waters fast. Divers were deployed that evening. 5 of them, suited in thick neoprene, oxygen tanks strapped tight, eyes narrowed behind fogged masks. They searched the perimeter around the boat first. Then they went farther. They dropped markers, recorded coordinates, moved grid by grid. Day 1 ended with nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a strand of hair, not a drag mark in the soil. The sheriff gave a statement. "We're doing everything we can." We asked the public to avoid speculation. By day 2 the mood had shifted. The teams were quieter. Questions got shorter. The volunteers who had offered to hand out water and sandwiches started heading home. Mia's photo was printed and taped to utility poles. Jamal brought Zora to the station just once. And when she asked if the water was going to bring her mommy back, he didn't answer. He just held her tighter. On day 3, a search dog from Augusta was brought in. They let it sniff Mia's denim jacket before placing it in a patrol boat. The dog barked wildly at one section of shoreline, but divers found nothing. The current had likely carried whatever scent remained far from the scene. They used underwater drones on day 4. They returned muddy footage of rusted debris, sunken tires, and shadows that vanished before they could be identified. The 5th morning, a detective walked to Jamal and said quietly that the odds were decreasing by the hour. Bodies, he explained, usually surface within 48 hours. When they don't, they often don't. By the end of the week, the boats were docked. The helicopters stopped flying. The divers packed up. And just like that, the lake went still again. The case was labeled as a likely drowning. No foul play suspected. No further searches planned. There was no casket, no procession, no gravesite to kneel beside. Just folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and silence too big for a school gym. The memorial was held 2 weeks after the search was called off. In the same building where Jamal used to teach metaphors and Baldwin in the beauty of a well-placed pause. But that day he didn't speak. Not once. He stood near the bleachers, his hands clenched behind his back, staring at a box that held no body, no closure, only flowers arranged like they were apologizing for not being more. Mia's photo sat on an easel beside it, her military portrait, crisp and official, with that firm jaw and tired smile. The nurse's scrubs, the wedding photos, the candid shots from beach trips and cookouts. None of that was displayed. Just the one picture. The one where she looked like she belonged to the state. Her coworkers came, still in hospital shoes, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and overtime. They hugged Jamal gently, whispered strong and so sorry, and let us know if you need anything. But their eyes said something else. Pity maybe, or confusion. A few of Jamal's students slipped in late. They didn't know what to say either, but they knew he deserved to be seen. Some of them held roses bought with coins. Others just stood in the back, hats in hand, trying to understand how the man who taught them about resilience was now a shape barely standing beneath a gymnasium light. Mia's mother sat in the front row. Her hands trembled the entire service. She kept wiping beneath her glasses, even when no new tears came. Her body leaned slightly forward, as if waiting for someone to arrive. When a woman from the church offered her a tissue, she whispered, "I still don't believe it," and the tissue stayed clutched in her fist until the end. Zora sat between Jamal and her grandmother. Her legs swung gently beneath the folding chair. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just kept looking at the box with a tilted head, confused. At one point, she tugged on Jamal's sleeve and asked, "Daddy, why is it empty?" And Jamal couldn't answer. Because how do you explain a vanishing to a child? How do you tell your daughter that sometimes people disappear without a sound, that the world keeps turning even when the person who made it feel safe is nowhere to be found? How do you convince her to stop waiting by the door? The pastor said words. He read a psalm. He talked about God's timing and eternal peace and trusting the path ahead. But his voice echoed too loudly, too clean, like it didn't belong in a space still raw with confusion. When it was over, no one lingered long. People left in small clusters, holding to-go cups of sweet tea and program leaflets that said, "In loving memory," but carried no date of death. Just a dash. And Jamal stayed behind. After they folded the chairs. After the janitor turned off half the lights. He sat on the bottom row of the bleachers, staring at the spot where the box had been. And for a long time he didn't move. Because it wasn't grief that kept him frozen. It was the question he couldn't shake. What if she wasn't gone? What if she never went into the water at all? He started sleeping on the floor. At first, to feel closer to the earth. Something solid. Then because he stopped sleeping at all. The apartment felt louder without her, as if every clock, every faucet, every creak in the floor had grown teeth. He stopped eating regularly, forgot appointments, drank coffee that sat cold. He'd wake up sweating from dreams that weren't really dreams, just moments of her laughing, brushing her hair, walking back through the door like nothing had happened. Some nights, he swore he heard her voice behind him. Small things. Don't forget Zora's lunch. Close the fridge. Turn off the porch light. Sometimes he'd respond. Out loud. He'd walk to the lake twice that month. Once alone, once with Zora, and just stare. Waiting for the water to give her back. At work, he tried to fake it, but the students noticed. The principal noticed. The final warning came after he missed an entire week with no call. His desk was cleared out before he got back. He didn't argue, just nodded and walked away. He stopped writing poetry, stopped shaving, let the bills pile up, let time pass without marking it. The hardest part wasn't that she was gone. It was that she left without saying goodbye. No crash, no gunshot, no clue, just a hole that didn't make a sound. And when you don't have answers, your mind writes its own. Was she scared? Did she regret going? Did she fall asleep under the sun and never wake up? Did she slip and hit her head and wait for someone to notice? Or did she choose to disappear? No matter how many times Jamal tried to rebuild the story, one thing never changed. She was gone. And every day after that felt like trying to walk through wet cement. October 2022, Jacksonville, Florida. He didn't tell many people he was leaving. There wasn't much to explain. No more job. No more savings. No more reason to stay in a city that now felt like a graveyard where nothing had been buried. He packed what he could fit in the back seat. Clothes, Zora's books, his mother's medication, and drove south without a plan, only a direction. By the time they crossed the state line, the air felt heavier or thicker, like it carried a kind of heat that stayed even at night. Jacksonville wasn't home, but it wasn't Atlanta either, and that was the point. They ended up in a one-bedroom apartment tucked behind a liquor store on Moncrief Road, the kind of neighborhood where sirens weren't a surprise, where people kept curtains drawn. And conversations short. The building smelled like mildew and fried food, the walls were thin, and the AC only worked when it felt like it. But it was something. Jamal gave his mother the bedroom, Miss Claudine Braddock, 63, diabetic and half-blind, but still sharp enough to read you with one sentence. She moved slow now, used a walker, and kept a kitchen radio tuned to gospel stations, even when no one was listening. Zora slept on the pull-out. She didn't complain. She never did. She just asked how long they'd be there, and Jamal said, just till things get better. She nodded like she understood, but she was 8, and 8-year-olds don't know that sometimes better never comes. Jamal took the floor. He registered for Uber 2 days after they moved in. Not because he wanted to, not because it was part of a plan, but because something had to give, and the rent wasn't going to pay itself. There was no speech, no dramatic pause, no weighing of options. Just an old laptop balanced on a milk crate in the corner of their new living room, the hum of a standing fan in the background, and Jamal typing in his information with the same numb focus he used to grade essays. He used to write recommendations for students heading off to college. Now he was uploading his driver's license and waiting for an email that would determine how many miles he'd drive to keep the lights on. The background check came back the next day. Clean record, valid license, former teacher. Nothing to flag, nothing to pause. He didn't even flinch when he clicked submit. He borrowed $80 from an old friend just to get the car detailed because he couldn't afford people stepping into something that smelled like old grief. Bought a cheap charger, stocked water in the cup holder, printed out the Uber decal, and slid it against the passenger side window with quiet precision. He watched a few YouTube videos that night: how to be a 5-star Uber driver, what to do if you get pulled over with a passenger, safety tips for nighttime rides. By Saturday evening, he was live on the app. Phone mounted, gas tank halfway, nerves flat. His first ride was a nurse heading to Baptist Medical Center for a double shift. She said she was tired. He said nothing. His second was a teenager in a black hoodie, blasting music through broken earbuds, going 3 miles to his girlfriend's house. He didn't say thank you. By the fourth ride, Jamal wasn't looking at faces anymore. Just names, addresses, surge zones. Each ride was a transaction, not a conversation. And that's how it stayed. He drove mostly at night. It was easier that way, less traffic, fewer eyes, more silence. He kept the revolver in the glove box. A .38 with a wooden grip passed down from his father, who brought it back from Vietnam and told him, "You don't carry this to use it. You carry it so you don't forget you have a choice." Jamal didn't reach for it, not even once. But he always checked to make sure it was there. He wore the same hoodie most nights, cap low, eyes forward. He drove drunks home from strip clubs, teenagers to overnight shifts at Waffle House, nurses to 3 a.m. rotations. Nobody asked questions. Nobody recognized him. That was the beauty of it. In that front seat, he was just another man trying to stay ahead of the bills. But when the ride was over, when the doors shut and the silence came back, there was still the weight of everything he couldn't outrun. At home, he tried. He tried hard. He read to Zora at night, sometimes the same story 3 times because she said it helped her sleep. He brushed her hair before school, always from the bottom up so it didn't tug too much. He packed her lunch and added little notes in her backpack. "You got this. Make good choices. I'm proud of you." She still asked about Mia. "Do you think Mommy misses me? Do you think she's looking for us? Do you think she remembers what I look like?" In Jamal, he'd pause, swallow the truth, and say something soft like, "Of course she does," even when he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. Miss Claudine noticed the change. She always did. She told him one morning, while peeling sweet potatoes with swollen hands, "Grief don't end, baby. It just moves in, takes a chair, and waits till it feels like talking." He didn't respond. He just nodded and kept washing dishes. But her words stayed with him. They always did. There were good days. Days when Zora made him laugh so hard he forgot where he was. Days when his mother hummed a tune from the kitchen, and it made the apartment feel warm, if only for a minute. But those moments were borrowed. They never lasted. And at night, when the ride slowed down and the streetlights flickered past his windshield like ghosts, Jamal would think about the water, about the way her voice still lived in his head, about the life they had built, and the way it was taken without warning. He didn't know what healing looked like, but he knew this wasn't it. He kept driving, kept surviving, kept putting one foot in front of the other. But deep down something had shifted. Not rage, not revenge, just the quiet, sinking realization that the world he used to know was gone, and no one was coming to save him from what was waiting down the road. March 12th, 2023, just before 10 p.m. Jamal was about to end his shift when a ping came in from the Hyatt Regency riverfront. And without thinking too much about it, he hit accept because it was close, the rating was high, and it seemed like an easy ride to end the night. He pulled up to the front entrance, where the overhead lights threw long reflections across the wet pavement, and he watched the hotel doors slide open as a couple walked out laughing. Their bodies leaned into each other like they didn't care who was watching. The woman had her heels in one hand. The man was holding his blazer by 2 fingers over his shoulder, and when she laughed, Jamal froze. Because that laugh didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone buried 9 months ago. He didn't turn around right away, didn't shift in his seat, just stared straight ahead as the back door opened and they climbed in, her perfume catching the air, just like it used to on Sunday mornings when she'd come back from early shifts and crawl into bed next to him. He heard her voice first, light and familiar, and then his, the voice of a man he once called brother, who used to watch Zora when they couldn't afford a sitter, who gave a toast at their wedding and promised to always have their back. Jamal didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't even glance in the mirror right away. He just started driving, hands steady, eyes focused on the road, because his body knew if moved too fast, everything might come crashing down inside him. She leaned into the seat, tossed her heels onto the floorboard, laughed again, and the man next to her joked about how wild their night had been, how nobody in Tampa would believe half of it, and how they should probably lay low for a bit longer. That's when she said it, soft but clear, still can't believe that insurance check went through, and her laugh followed, like she hadn't just admitted to erasing a man's entire life for money. He heard Dushan respond with something casual like, "That's 'cause you're good at this," and she answered, "You think he ever suspected?" To which he said, if he did, he ain't do nothing about it. He's probably crying in some basement somewhere, clutching a photo. Jamal didn't move, he didn't react when they laughed at the thought of him broken, when they joked about the signatures and the fake witness statements, and the fact that no one questioned a widow who knew how to cry on. He just tapped the screen, changed the route, clicked mute on the navigation, and kept driving, left when he should have gone straight, down a road he hadn't taken before, a road that wouldn't show up unless you knew how to look for it. They didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in each other, in the details of their new place in Tampa, in how they wanted to change their names again before tax season, in how nobody had asked about Mia in months, in how Dushan was planning to invest the rest of the money in crypto. Jamal kept his eyes on the road, kept his foot steady on the gas, and let their voices fill the cabin like background noise. But every word was a blade, every laugh a cut, and he didn't need a rear-view mirror to know what betrayal looked like. It was sitting right behind him, wearing the face of the woman who once promised forever, and the man who once called him brother. He didn't blink, he didn't yell, he just drove. Because sometimes pain doesn't scream, it listens. And that night, Jamal Braddock was listening to the sound of his old life, sitting comfortably in the backseat of a car he paid for, talking about him like he never mattered, like he wasn't the reason they could afford their new life. So he changed the destination, and he didn't say a word. The streets grew quieter as Jamal steered the car toward the Port District, the kind of area that felt abandoned even when it wasn't. The buildings were industrial, weathered, windows boarded up with faded for sale signs. The kind of place people didn't visit unless they had a reason to be there. It was far from the touristy streets by the beach, out of view, where the neon lights of hotels and bars couldn't reach. Mia noticed first. Her voice, casual but sharp, broke through the heavy silence of the car. "This isn't the route." Her words hung in the air for a moment, but Jamal didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, watching the headlights cut through the darkness. Deshane was next. He glanced at the GPS, then back out the window, his nerves starting to show. "Yo, where we headed, man?" Jamal didn't answer. He just kept driving, his grip on the wheel steady, like he knew exactly where they were going. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, filling the spaces between their breaths. Deshane's panic grew. "You okay, bro?" He shifted in his seat, eyes darting between the dark streets and the locked door beside him, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. Jamal's fingers didn't falter. With one smooth motion he reached for the door lock, his thumb pressing down hard on the switch, sealing them in. The click echoed in the car, and the atmosphere grew thicker. He turned off the radio. The silence in the car deepened. Now there was only the sound of their breathing, heavy, controlled, waiting for something to break. Jamal's mind wasn't racing, it was steady focused. He wasn't lost in grief or in the rush of betrayal. He was locked into something darker, something colder. The weight of his past was no longer just an anchor, had become a weapon. The car slid to a stop in front of an abandoned warehouse, its walls scarred by years of neglect. A rusted chain-link fence stood tall on one side, a forgotten guard against a world that had already moved on. The lot was empty except for a few broken-down vehicles and piles of debris that hadn't seen a cleaner in years. He put the car in park, but still he didn't turn around. The seconds stretched out, suffocating in their silence. He sat there, hands on the wheel, his breath steady but slow. Mia shifted in her seat, her voice quiet but filled with confusion. "Jamal?" She said it like a question, like she was trying to make sense of the man in front of her, trying to understand the driver she'd once known so well. But Jamal didn't turn, he didn't even look in the mirror. He just took off his cap, placed it on the dashboard, and let the tension build in the air. The weight of everything between them, the lies, the betrayal, the shattered trust, was now heavy enough to fill the entire car. He felt the words before he spoke them, the heat in his chest that had been building for months, but had no place to go until now. "You were supposed to be dead, Mia." The words came out low, almost measured, like he was speaking to a stranger. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide, struggling to process. "Jamal." He finally looked at her, not through the rear view, not through a glance in the mirror. He turned his head, meeting her gaze through the space between them. "You killed the man I was supposed to be," he said, his voice steady, like he was describing someone else's life. In the back seat, flinched, the air between them shifting. The chain was frozen, the car was still. The weight of Jamal's words hit hard, silencing the man who used to call him brother. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Like the world had fallen away, and left only the two of them in the car, suspended in a truth they both couldn't avoid. Mia opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of what to say, unsure of what she could say. And in that silence, Jamal didn't look away. He didn't shift. His eyes remained locked on hers, cold and unforgiving. Grief didn't kill Jamal Braddock, betrayal did. The car was motionless, but the air between them burned with the heat of broken promises. Mia was still a stranger to him now. The woman who had once shared everything with him had vanished the day she stepped onto that boat, the day she left him with nothing but questions. And now, the man who had once shared his life with him, Shane, the friend who had known all his secrets, sat in the back, watching a man who had already died inside. Jamal hadn't been living for months. He had been surviving one ride, one day, one breath at a time. But tonight, the survivor had been replaced by someone else entirely. The tension crackled in the air, thick and unspoken. Jamal knew what he had to do, knew that the life he had before was gone, and what came next was inevitable. The night was far from over, but this moment, this was the turning point. The car was still. The sound of rain tapping lightly on the roof was the only noise. A soft reminder that the world outside was still turning, still moving, still unaware of the tragedy unfolding inside. Jamal reached over, his hand steady, and pulled the glove box open. The revolver was right where he'd left it, under a stack of old receipts, a pair of worn gloves, and a half-empty bottle of water. It was the same. His father had carried back from Vietnam. The same one Jamal had kept loaded but untouched. Like it was there for a reason he could never explain. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed it and held it in his palm, the weight of it familiar, comforting. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just another thing he had to carry. Mia's breath hitched when she saw it. Her eyes went wide, a mix of shock and fear, but there was no disbelief. Not anymore. She knew who he was now. She knew what he was capable of. "Jamal, please," Mia whispered, her voice trembling, barely a breath. "This isn't you. Don't do this." Shane's voice cut through the tension. He shouted, his voice rising with panic. "What the hell are you doing, man? Put that thing down." Jamal didn't move. He didn't respond. He just sat there, looking straight ahead, the revolver still in his hand, the weight of it anchoring him to a moment that had already passed. The anger he thought would burn hot and fast never came. There was no fire, no rage, just a cold clarity that settled over him like fog. "This isn't rage," he said, his voice low and calm. Quiet conviction in every word. "This is clarity." The words hung between them, a final declaration. There was no room for argument, no room for pleading. What was done was done. What had been lost couldn't be returned. And the man who once stood in front of classrooms, who believed in second chances, was no longer the same person. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Jamal's hands didn't shake. His heart didn't race. He wasn't fighting the impulse to pull the trigger. He was waiting for something sign. A signal, something to tell him this was the end. The rain kept falling outside, but inside the world had stopped. In one smooth motion, he raised the gun. Mia flinched. The chain lunged forward, hands pressing against the window as if to push the door open to run, to escape, but the locks clicked in time. It didn't matter. Jamal turned slightly, his eyes meeting Mia's. For a brief moment, she saw the man she once knew, the man she thought she had left behind. She opened her mouth to say something. The words didn't come. There was no apology left. There was no explanation that would undo what had happened. And then, without hesitation, without another word, Jamal pulled the trigger. 2 shots. The first one was clean. The second one was quieter, softer, almost like the gun knew it was only needed once. And then there was silence. A silence that filled the car, that stretched between Jamal and the people who had betrayed him. that filled the empty space where love used to be. There were no screams. There were no cries for help. Just the soft echo of gunfire, the hollow sound of lives lost, and nothing to fill the void. Mia and Deshawn didn't move. They didn't make a sound. The weight of what Jamal had just done settled over them like a blanket. A quiet understanding that this was the end of the story. Jamal sat back, the revolver still in his hand, his eyes empty but calm. The car, now quiet, felt like a tomb, like a place where time had finally run out. His breathing slowed, steady and controlled. He didn't look at them again. He didn't need to. The silence stretched on. The rain didn't stop. The night didn't stop. But for Jamal, the world had stopped turning. He had made his choice. He had drawn the line. And when the sun rose the next morning, it would rise on a world that didn't know the cost of the choices that had been made in the dark. March 13th, 2023, 5:55 a.m. The first light of morning barely crept through the blinds as the news report crackled to life. The anchor's voice was steady rehearsed, too practiced to show any hint of the chaos behind the scenes. A burned-out vehicle was found near Blunt Island Terminal. Police say it may be connected to a missing rideshare driver. The words felt hollow in the quiet apartment, filling the air like an unanswered question. The anchor continued, but Jamal wasn't there to hear it. The screen flashed images of the burnt-out car, the one that had once belonged to him, the one that still carried the weight of the decisions made just hours before. No bodies had been recovered, just the charred remnants of leather seats, twisted metal and blood stains that told a story no one was ready to understand. The investigators were still processing the scene, but the likelihood of finding anything left, any trace of Mia, Deshawn or Jamal, was slim. Jamal's Uber account had been deactivated earlier that night. No warning, no goodbye. Just a simple notification. Account suspended due to safety concerns. The app's cold corporate language didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a final severing, a disconnection from everything that had once been a part of him. That morning, as the world began its usual rhythm, Zora was waking up to a new reality. She had been at school the day before, going about her day like any other 8-year-old, laughing with her friends, talking about her favorite cartoons. But when the social walked into the classroom, everything changed. Her name was Mrs. Edwards. She had been working with child services for years. Her voice was soft but firm, a practiced calmness that came with delivering bad news. "Zora," she said, kneeling down to her level. "Your dad had to go away for a while." Zora didn't understand. She didn't know what away meant, but her face shifted with the fear that only comes when a child knows something's wrong but can't place exactly what. Her little hands gripped the edges of her desk as she looked around. Searching for someone to tell her this was just another adult conversation, one she could ignore, one that wouldn't follow her home. But Mrs. Edwards wasn't leaving. The ride back to the foster home was quiet. The school bell rang in the distance, but Zora didn't hear it. She wasn't listening to anything but the questions that filled her head. Where was Daddy? Why wasn't he picking her up like he always did? Meanwhile, at home, Claudine Braddock, Jamal's mother, woke to an entirely different kind of silence. The kind of silence that gnaws at your insides, leaving you feeling exposed and wrong. She hadn't seen Jamal since the night before, hadn't heard from him in hours. She had assumed he was out driving. But something about this morning felt different. The knock at her door was soft but insistent, and when she opened it, she was met by 2 officers holding an envelope. One of them introduced himself as Detective Hall, but he didn't say much else. He handed her the envelope, and when she saw the official stamp, the weight of it seemed to grow heavier in her hands. Inside the envelope was $7,000 in cash, neatly folded, along with a set of guardianship forms. Claudine's hands shook as she read the note scrawled on a piece of paper inside. It was brief, almost detached, as if the person who wrote it was saying goodbye without actually saying the words. "I gave them what they wanted, now maybe I can rest." The note wasn't signed, but Claudine knew deep in her bones, that this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just a payment for something she didn't understand yet. This was Jamal's way of saying goodbye, even if he couldn't do it out loud. And for a moment, everything shifted. The pain of his disappearance, the confusion of Zora's questions, the empty feeling in her chest, it all faded away, replaced by something that felt like understanding. The grief was no longer just the loss of her son. It was something much deeper, much harder to digest. In the days that followed, the authorities worked the scene by Blunt Island Terminal, still trying to make sense of what had happened. But no one seemed to connect the dots. The police were too caught up in the technicalities, the burned car, the lack of bodies, the missing Uber driver, while Claudine sat in her small living room, reading and rereading that note, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Her thoughts kept returning to Zora. She was just a child, and now her world was different. The story would eventually reach the media. The news would pick up on the strange disappearance, the connection to the missing rideshare driver. They'd run stories on the burning car, the strange nature of the crime, possible link between the vanishing driver and the couple that had been found with him. But none of it would get to the heart of what happened. None of it would answer the one question that mattered most to Claudine. What had Jamal really done? And why was it so hard to understand? March 14, 2023, 6:31 p.m. Big Cypress National Preserve. Florida. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the Everglades, and the humid air felt thick with the promise of the night to come. The sky was already turning shades of deep orange and purple, the kind of fading light that made everything look softer, quieter. But there was nothing soft about what was happening out there in the swamp. A blurry figure appeared on the security camera footage. The image was grainy, indistinct, but there was no mistaking the way the figure moved. A purposeful stride through the tall, wet grasses of the preserve, a backpack slung over one shoulder, a walking stick in the other hand, cutting through the dense undergrowth like they had been here before. That figure, Jamal Braddock, was the last known sighting of him. The man who had once stood in classrooms and told students to write their own stories. The man who had driven through the nights just trying to survive. The man who had been ripped apart by betrayal, was now walking alone into one of the most remote parts of Florida, into a wilderness that no one knew him to be familiar with. And that was it, the final image, a blurry shape on a camera in the middle of nowhere. The revolver, his father's revolver, was never found. There were no traces of it, no indication of where it had gone, or even if it had been used. It was as if it had vanished into the same air that had swallowed Jamal's name. And so, for the next few days, Jamal was just gone. The authorities had no leads, no evidence to chase. Mia and Dee Shane, still thought to be missing, had been reported as such, but the search for them had been nothing more than a formality. People were looking in the wrong places, chasing down dead ends, but the truth had already slipped away, hidden under the murk of broken trust and calculated lies. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when Jamal's family made inquiries, and the media began picking up on the odd circumstances of his disappearance, that anything resembling an investigation began. By then, though it was too late, the trail had gone cold. The authorities had their hands tied, no bodies to identify, no evidence to tie anyone to the crime. Mia and Deshawn were officially listed as missing persons, but the investigation felt rushed, half-hearted. A job done just to say it was done. The sheriff's office filed the paperwork, but the case quickly slipped from the headlines, buried beneath the relentless tide of other unsolved mysteries. No one seemed to care, not the media, not the public. The story of the missing Uber driver had faded into the background, overshadowed by the sheer randomness of the crime, but not for Jamal's family. Claudine Braddock had never stopped looking, even when the police closed the case, even when the world told her to give up. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something in her gut told her that her son was still out there, somewhere in the distance, waiting to be found. It was a mother's instinct, the kind that doesn't let go, no matter how many months pass or how many dead ends you hit. She held on to the hope that she would find him, that he was still alive, but every day it seemed less likely. Meanwhile, Zora, Jamal's daughter, was shuffled between social workers, moving through the system like a leaf on a current she didn't understand. Her world was shattered, but no one was there to pick up the pieces. No one could explain why her father had disappeared, why her mother was gone, why her life felt like it had unraveled overnight. There were no answers for her, just the quiet ache of a child forced to understand loss too soon. Back in the Everglades, the search for Jamal dwindled. The swamp swallowed everything, his footprints, the remnants of his father's revolver, the memory of a man who once walked through life with a purpose. The place was unforgiving, the land thick with mud, water, and the scent of decay. The trees stood tall and silent, watching, as they had for years, and the water kept flowing, as it always had. Jamal was just another name on a list of forgotten souls, lost in the vastness of a world that never stopped turning. But one thing remained undeniable. The story wasn't over. It couldn't be. Jamal had walked into that swamp, but he hadn't disappeared. Not entirely. He had left a trail that no one could see, a trail buried beneath lies, betrayal, and the weight of his own choices. The question was never if he'd come back. It was when. And for Claudine, for Zora, the only thing left was to wait. Wait for an answer. Wait for justice. Because some stories are never finished. They just take a little longer to unfold. The truth didn't come in a single revelation. It came in pieces. Slow, painful pieces that made Jamal feel like the ground he stood on was crumbling beneath him. Like the world he had once known was nothing more than a ghost story. Parallel timelines unfolded as the investigation uncovered details Jamal had never known. Flashbacks took the audience through the slow unraveling of his marriage to Mia, through moments of betrayal that had taken root long before the boating trip. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single event. It had been building for months. Mia and Shane had started their affair 6 months before the trip to Lake Hartwell. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a calculated decision, one that Mia had made with careful consideration. Deshaun had always been the kind of man who operated in shadows, someone who played by his own rules and lived on the edge. But Mia had been searching for something more, something he could give her. Freedom, excitement, a way out. They found that Deshaun's gambling habit had spiraled out of control, and as his debts mounted, the idea of insurance money began to look like a lifeline. Mia, always sharp and calculating, had suggested the unthinkable. They could fake her death, collect the life insurance payout, and start fresh. It was a plan made in whispers, in stolen moments, and as the weeks passed, it became more than just a thought. It became a necessity. They forged documents, death certificates, reports from a coroner who never existed, fake witnesses, and pieced together a story that was as convincing as it was dangerous. They had everything they needed, a narrative that would erase her from the world, a plan that would make them rich, and a new life waiting for them. As Mia and Deshane's plan unfolded, Jamal's world was quietly falling apart. The signs were there, but he couldn't see them. The late nights, the whispered conversations, the way Mia pulled away, emotionally distant even when she was sitting right next to him. The arguments that had no real cause. The days when she was too tired to talk. Jamal never knew the man who was slipping into his home. He never knew the way Shane had wormed his way into their lives, pretending to be the supportive friend while secretly betraying him. And when Mia went missing, Jamal was left with nothing but unanswered questions. But the real toll was the silence. The endless silence that settled in when he tried to move forward. When he tried to fill the space that used to be filled with laughter, with love. Flashbacks of Jamal's life before the disappearance show a man caught between two worlds. He was living a nightmare, but in the daylight, he was pretending to be fine. The way his hands shook as he held his daughter. How he would sometimes stop mid-conversation, as if forgetting who he was talking to. The constant weight of insomnia that gnawed at him. Nights where he didn't sleep. Not because he couldn't, but because the questions wouldn't let him rest. The counselor's office was where the truth began to surface. Jamal had gone there, not expecting answers, but hoping for some form of peace. What he got instead was a slow, painful unraveling of his own mind. I felt like a ghost long before they left me, Jamal admitted in one session. His voice, hoarse and tired, spoke volumes of the man who had been trying to outrun grief, who had tried to fill the silence with distractions. But it had never worked. Not really. The audience sees it wasn't the gun. It wasn't just the anger or the betrayal that drove Jamal to that moment of decision. It was the silence, the hours spent in a void where no one would speak the truth, where his questions were met with nothing but emptiness. The sleep-deprived nights, the constant ache of not knowing what had happened to the woman he had loved, the questions that had no answers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, alive, looking back at him with the same love, the same promise. But it wasn't real anymore. It was a memory, a ghost, and the longer he let himself hold on to it, the more it slipped away. And then the moment came, the moment when the weight of everything he had lost crushed him entirely. Jamal wasn't just holding a gun in that car. He was holding on to a version of his life that had never really existed, a story written by the people he trusted most. The betrayal didn't just shatter his trust. It shattered his identity. In that moment, as he drove the car into the dark, his mind wasn't focused on revenge. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity. Clarity that no one would ever be able to give him. No closure would be found in a courtroom. No apology would make the past disappear. What had been taken from him couldn't be returned. What happens when justice wears a face and grief pulls the trigger? For Jamal, the truth was simple. He had been destroyed by the people he loved most. And the silence between them wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of everything breaking down, piece by piece. It wasn't the gunshot that ended his story. It wasn't the cold metal that shattered the lives of Mia and Shane. It was the knowledge that, no matter what he did next, nothing would ever be the same. Nothing would ever fill the hole they had left behind. 15 minutes. That's all it took. 15 minutes for Jamal. Make a decision that would change everything. A decision that most of us will never have to make. A choice that the mind can't quite understand, but the heart might. But what would you have done? If the law failed, if the truth was stolen from you, if your world collapsed, what would you do when everything you trusted, everything you built, turned out to be a lie? Jamal didn't ask for this. He didn't choose it. The betrayal came first. The lies came first. And by the time he understood the depths of what had happened, there was no turning back. The question isn't about right or wrong. It isn't about justice or vengeance. The question is simple. What happens when betrayal replaces love? When everything you thought you knew about someone, about yourself, gets torn apart in an instant? When the people you trusted most were the ones who saw you as expendable? What happens to the man left standing in the ruins of his own life? Jamal's choices were not born from rage. They were born from loss, grief, a slow, creeping understanding that his life, his real life, had been stolen from him in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The truth didn't matter anymore, not when it was already too late to fix what had been broken. And so the final scene played out, not in fury, but in resignation. In clarity, he made the choice to end their lives in the only way he could, by taking away everything they had stolen, not just their breath, but the life they had built while he drowned in the silence they left behind. The final shot. Swamp mist, thick and unyielding. The sound of footsteps on wet ground. The rustling of reeds in the night air. A figure moves through the haze, small but resolute, fading into the landscape, walking away from everything. From the car. From the betrayal. From the life he had once known. They took his life when they faked her death. He ended theirs and disappeared into his own. The question that lingers that will never have a clear answer is this. Was Jamal wrong? Could he have done something else? Could he have lived with the loss without the revenge? Or was this his only way out? His only chance to reclaim what was taken from him, to silence the ghosts that haunted him, to make sure his daughter never had to know how deep the betrayal went. In the end, we're left with more questions than answers, more shadows than clarity. But isn't that what makes us human? Isn't that what drives us to question, to search for meaning, even when the answers seem impossible to find? We are all shaped by what we lose, but how we choose to rebuild is the only thing that defines us. This wasn't a revenge story. It wasn't about killing to get back at someone. This was grief left untreated. This was trust shattered and justice ignored. This was the story of a man who couldn't escape what had been done to him, who had no one left to turn to but himself. Story 3. They were deceiving each other. Just 24 hours after their wedding, a day meant to symbolize love and new beginnings, everything shattered. He thought he'd found the one, the woman who could give him the life he'd always dreamed of. She believed she had found security, a partner to share her future. But beneath the vows and promises, both were hiding truths too dangerous to ignore. His world came crashing down when he uncovered her lies. And in the chaos of betrayal, something inside him snapped. What happens when two people, both desperate for something more, play each other's game of deceit? And what price are they willing to pay when the truth finally comes to light? Marcus Elwood Cage was born on July 7, 1999 in Macon, Georgia. Raised by his grandmother after his mother disappeared into the haze of her own struggles, Marcus grew up with a sense of abandonment he never quite shook off. His grandmother, a tough but loving woman, did her best to raise him, but Marcus was a child of broken promises. She couldn't give him everything he wanted, but she made sure he had enough to survive. He never had the luxury of feeling truly secure. That feeling would haunt him throughout his life. The constant itch for something more, something better, something that might finally give him what he had always craved. Freedom from the feeling of being trapped. From an early age, Marcus understood the art of survival. He had an innate charm, the kind that could make anyone believe in him, even if he didn't fully believe in himself. He learned early on that he didn't need to work hard to get what he wanted. He just needed to talk a good game. This skill would become his greatest asset. Whether it was convincing a friend to let him crash on their couch for a while, or charming an unsuspecting boss into giving him a job, Marcus had a knack for making people think he was something he wasn't. By the time he was 24, Marcus had lived a life full of fleeting jobs, dead-end relationships, and half-hearted attempts at something bigger. He had worked as an Instacart driver, delivering groceries to people who had better lives than he could even imagine. He had dabbled in the world of cryptocurrency, calling himself a mentor, offering advice to others who were as lost as he was. But the truth was, he didn't know much more than the next person. He was just selling the dream, pretending to be someone who had it all figured out. Marcus was an aspiring music producer, another dream that kept slipping through his fingers. He had the equipment, the connections, and the ambition. What he lacked was the work ethic and the drive to make it happen. He talked about getting big, making it in the industry, but his passion never translated into real results. He had the talent, but he lacked the consistency. Every beat he produced sounded like the start of something great, but none of them ever made it past the demo stage. His criminal history was a reflection of his inability to control his impulses. 2 fraud charges were enough to put a permanent stain on his record. 1 charge resulted in a suspended sentence. But Marcus knew better than to let the law slow him down. He had always found ways to talk his way out of tight situations, convincing people he wasn't a threat, that he was just trying to make it. The truth was, Marcus wasn't good with money. He was good spending it, good at using it to lure people in, but not good at keeping it. He lived gig to gig, always hoping the next opportunity would be the one that changed everything, but it never was. Money was the root of Marcus' frustration. He had always wanted more than he could have. More money, more freedom, more respect. He felt like life had always given him just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. He dreamed of the day when he wouldn't have to worry about bills or rent or debt. He dreamed of a day when he could buy whatever he wanted, live wherever he wanted, and never have to answer to anyone. But for all his charm and ambition, Marcus was constantly stuck in a cycle of living paycheck to paycheck, with no real plan to break free. He'd been through relationships that never lasted. Women who either wanted something he didn't have, or saw through his lies. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't honest either. Love to Marcus was just another way to get what he wanted: attention, admiration, a roof over his head for a while. He wasn't looking for true connection, he was looking for convenience. He wanted someone who could give him the things he couldn't get on his own, even if it meant deceiving them along the way. Marcus had always been a risk taker, but never in a way that made him feel proud. He didn't make calculated decisions, he made emotional ones, driven by desperation. He was always one step away from a breakdown, constantly feeling like his next move could either propel him into success or plunge him deeper into failure. That sense of instability, of never knowing if the next move would pay off, was his constant companion. But everything changed when he first saw her profile. Eleanor Vance was born on March 2nd, 1954 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Her life, once full of promise, was a tale of dazzling beauty and ambition. In her 30s, she was the epitome of the Florida lifestyle, a former Avon beauty consultant who knew how to sell more than just skincare products. She sold dreams. Her beauty, radiant and youthful, could light up a room, and her confidence in her appearance became her armor. She had the kind of allure that turned heads, the kind that made men look twice and women envy her presence. In those days, she wasn't just a beauty, she was a force. A woman who knew how to use what she had to get ahead in a world where image was everything. But beauty fades, and Eleanor's was no exception. By her 60s, the phone calls from her children had stopped coming. It wasn't sudden, it was a gradual drift. One that Eleanor couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't stop. Her relationship with her 3 children, once close and full of shared holidays and family vacations, had deteriorated. They described her as controlling, emotionally manipulative, and overly demanding. To them, Eleanor was a woman who would never stop asking for more. More money, more time, more attention. It was never enough. Her children had grown tired of being gaslight into feeling guilty for not giving her what she wanted. They accused her of using emotional manipulation to keep them close, of guilt tripping them into offering more than they were willing to give. For Eleanor, it seemed like the world had started to pull away. The attention she had once commanded seemed to vanish, and she was left with the deep ache of being unneeded. Her children, though still alive and well, had distanced themselves. Eleanor never spoke about it directly, but the cracks in the relationship were clear, and they weighed heavily on her. So at 62, Eleanor decided to do something she'd never tried before: reinvent herself. In an age where the world could be anything you wanted it to be online, Eleanor saw an opportunity. She didn't need to get old. She didn't need to be forgotten. Instead, she would make herself new again, like a character out of a fairy tale. The internet had given birth to a new world of illusion, and Eleanor jumped in with both feet. Her Instagram, once a collection of family photos and children's birthdays, slowly morphed into a digital gallery of high-end glamour. She dug through her photo albums, dusted off old shots from her Avon days, when she was at her peak, looking flawless in designer dresses. Those images, captured under soft lighting, were carefully selected to create a persona of luxury. She wasn't just a woman in her 60s. She was a woman who still had it. Her Instagram was filled with vintage photos of her in elegant gowns, sitting by a pool in a mansion, or holding a glass of champagne at a posh event. But the truth was far from what she portrayed. The locations were rented, the expensive clothes were bought on credit, and the five-star hotel suites were just a backdrop to a life that didn't exist. Eleanor wasn't living the high life. She was simply posing in the remnants of it, hoping no one would notice the cracks. In her mind, it didn't matter if it was real. What mattered was how it looked. She carefully curated her life to appear perfect, to appear desirable. She sought validation in the form of likes and comments, the digital applause she couldn't get from her family. She had built an identity that, to the outside world, seemed unshakable. A glamorous, vibrant woman who defied her age and had everything together. But for Eleanor it was a mask. A mask she wore because behind it was only the loneliness of a woman abandoned by the people she had loved the most. The story she told online was one of excess. The lavish vacations to places she'd never been. The diamonds she posted in photos that were never actually hers. And the expensive cars she often posed next to. She was trying to create something. Trying to fill a void left by years of disappointment and broken relationships. But she didn't just post pictures of her ideal life. She carefully crafted the narrative to attract someone who would see the same potential in her that she saw in herself. She wasn't just a lonely woman seeking attention. She was a woman with something to offer, if only someone would see it. Her children had rejected her, but maybe someone else, someone younger, someone with a future, would see her as the prize she believed she still was. She was, in her own words, a diamond waiting to be discovered. She knew her value. She just needed someone who would recognize it. It started on May 17th, 2023. Both Marcus and Eleanor, each at different points in their lives, each with different needs, swiped right on a dating app called Golden Connection. For Marcus, the app wasn't about finding true love. It was about opportunity. It was a place where wealth, status, and desperation could be hidden behind flattering profile pictures and carefully crafted bios. For Eleanor, Golden Connection was her stage. A place to play the role she had perfected over years of manipulation and reinvention. Their first exchange was simple, but something about it lingered. Marcus, always the charmer, opened with a line that felt as rehearsed as it was honest. "I've always been attracted to strength. Older women just get it." Eleanor read the message in the middle of her morning coffee, staring at the phone like it was the start of something. She had seen messages like this before, but Marcus was different. There was something in his tone, something that caught her attention. He wasn't shy or awkward, he was confident, yet searching. He needed something, and Eleanor knew exactly what that was. She typed back quickly, her fingers moving without hesitation. "I don't have time for games. I know what I bring to the table." Marcus' smile curled as he read her response. He liked this. She didn't waste time, didn't beat around the bush. She was up front, and he could appreciate that. She wasn't hiding behind flirty emojis or endless small talk. She was direct, much like the women he'd encountered in the past who didn't pretend. Their conversation was easy, flowing with a kind of effortless chemistry that Marcus hadn't expected. Eleanor wasn't like the others. She didn't want to waste his time, and that made him intrigued. The more he spoke to her, the more he realized she wasn't just another lonely older woman hoping for affection. She was calculated, measured. This wasn't love. It was business. But what kind of exactly? Over the next few days, the text exchanges escalated. They didn't talk about hobbies or favorite music. They didn't waste time on trivial matters. Instead, the conversations circled around the things they both wanted. Money, comfort, a better life. It wasn't love that they were searching for, but stability. They both knew what the other was after. Marcus wanted a shortcut, a way to stop living paycheck to paycheck, to stop pretending he was fine with his mediocre existence. Eleanor, on the other hand, was looking for a man who could offer her security, the kind she hadn't had in years. The kind she had been chasing her entire life, but now, with the luxury of time running out, it needed to come quickly. Then came the phone calls. What started as flirty exchanges turned into late-night conversations that lasted hours. They'd talk about everything. Their pasts, their disappointments, their goals. Marcus would mention his failed dreams of becoming a music producer, how the hustle never quite paid off. Eleanor would tell him stories of her beauty days, of the men who once adored her, and how those days felt like a lifetime ago. It wasn't long before Eleanor invited Marcus to visit. She said she had a condo in Florida, a perfect weekend getaway, a place to escape the noise of everyday life. Marcus, ever the opportunist, didn't hesitate. He booked a flight, packed his bag, and boarded the plane with a sense of purpose that went beyond just meeting an older woman. This was about finding his next big break. When Marcus arrived at our condo, he was immediately struck by how perfect everything seemed. The view, the lavish decor. Everything looked expensive, well kept. But what Marcus didn't know was that this condo wasn't hers. It was rented. The view wasn't her own, and neither were the designer sofas. She had borrowed it from a friend, creating an illusion of luxury for him, just like everything else she'd built in her life. When he stepped inside, Eleanor was waiting at the door, her smile radiant as ever. She greeted him like an old friend, warm and welcoming. But beneath the surface, there was something more. She knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a relationship. It was a transaction. Marcus was her next move. They spent the weekend together. Dinners at upscale restaurants. Private walks on the beach. For Marcus, the weekend was a dream. He posted a picture on Instagram, his arm around her as they smiled under the fading sun, the ocean stretching endlessly behind them. Wifey material, he wrote, a subtle declaration of how easy it was to present the life he wanted to live. The comments came flooding in. Couple goals. Looking good together. But to Marcus, the picture was less about love and more about the future he hoped to build. Eleanor watched him as he posted the picture, her mind already calculating the next step. She had to be careful too. She had played this game before, but Marcus was different. He was eager, hungry for more. He was like her, desperate to escape the life he had, but he hadn't yet realized that he was just as trapped as she was. One evening, while they sipped wine on the balcony, Eleanor leaned in, her voice softer than usual. "Do you have debt?" Marcus froze for a moment. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. He wasn't prepared for this question, but it was too late to back out now. He was too far in, and she had just shown him a crack in her armor. He smiled, shifted in his chair, and replied, "Let's not talk about money. Let's talk about forever." The subject was dropped, but the tension lingered in the air between them. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, watching him closely, studying his every word. He was hiding something, she knew that, and she was no stranger to deception. She had mastered it. Still, the game was just beginning. He thought he had control, but soon he'd see that the real game was being played by her. That night, Marcus lay in bed, thinking about how easy it was to manipulate the situation. He had already started fantasizing about the things Eleanor could offer him. Her house, her wealth. They were all just a matter of time. But what he didn't know was that Eleanor was playing a much longer game. One that he wasn't prepared for. They both thought they were winning, but neither of them had realized that their winning moves would soon turn deadly. The summer of 2023 brought an accelerated sense of urgency to Marcus and Eleanor's relationship. What started as a simple online exchange quickly transformed into a whirlwind romance, driven by mutual interests, not in love, but in what each could take from the other. From June to August, their bond grew deeper, not because of affection, but because of shared ambition, hidden behind smiles and whispered promises. Marcus had made his intentions clear to his cousin during one of their late-night calls. He was speaking casually, but underneath the words, there was something cold, something calculating. "She's got retirement money, old jewelry. She's lonely. I'm doing what I gotta do." He had no illusions about Eleanor. To him, she was simply a means to an end. The promises of a future together didn't feel like a fairy tale. They felt like an investment. He wasn't looking for a soulmate. He was looking for a way out of the life that had trapped him for so long. It wasn't about love. It was about leverage. Eleanor to him was a stepping stone. The more he talked about her to his friends, the more the truth came out. And it was a truth he had already come to accept. Eleanor, on the other hand, was playing a different game. She wasn't naive. She knew what Marcus wanted, but she convinced herself that she had something to offer him that no one else could. The promise of stability. The illusion of wealth. She told her church friend one afternoon, as they sipped coffee over brunch, about Marcus. About the young man who had swept her off her feet. Or so she thought. "He's young, but he listens. He says I make him feel seen." Her words were wrapped in a sense of pride, but there was a hollow ring to them. Something unspoken. What Eleanor didn't realize was that the attention Marcus gave her wasn't out of love. It was out of convenience. He listened because he knew it was the easiest way to gain her trust. To make her feel needed. and ultimately to get closer to what he really wanted. Her money. The deeper they went into this charade, the more they both believed in their own lies. They weren't building a life together. They were playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. One evening in early September, Marcus presented Eleanor with a gold-plated ring. It wasn't the kind of ring someone would wear for the rest of their life. But to Eleanor it was perfect. She had always wanted something that symbolized security, something that made her feel valued, even if it was all a show. Marcus, of course, knew exactly what he was doing. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady but lacking any real emotion. Eleanor, caught in the moment, teared up. Her heart swelled with the validation she so desperately needed. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. But behind those tears, there was something darker. She wasn't just saying yes to a man. She was saying yes to the idea of love, to the illusion of a future with someone who promised her more than the loneliness had lived with for years. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a smile of love. It was a smile that knew he had her exactly where he wanted her. Neither of them meant it. They were both playing roles, acting out a script they had written together without realizing the deadly consequences that awaited them. The proposal wasn't about the future. It was about securing a position in each other's lives. A position that could potentially open doors to a life they both dreamed of, but neither could attain on their own. For Eleanor, the ring was a symbol of success. It wasn't about love. It was about the validation she had been craving. The acknowledgement that anyone, still saw her as valuable. And for Marcus, the ring was a ticket out of his life of failure. It was a means to an end, a way to gain access to the wealth and security he had only ever dreamed of. They both mistook manipulation for affection, exploitation for love. Eleanor's mind wandered, but not to the future they would build together. Instead, began thinking of her will. It wasn't something she discussed openly, but as she stared at the ring, she thought about how easy it would be to add Marcus to her will. He was the one, right? He had convinced her he was everything she needed. So why not take the next step? That very afternoon, Eleanor met a church friend for brunch. As they ate, the conversation turned to Marcus, to the new life Eleanor was starting with him, and what she saw as a second chance at happiness. "I'm adding him to my will. Just not yet," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her friend looked at her with concern, but Eleanor brushed it off. She wasn't worried. She had been down this road before. She was in control, and this time it would be different. But what Eleanor didn't realize was that the very thing she was trying to control, her future, her wealth, her stability, was slipping through her fingers faster than she could imagine. In her quest for security, she had overlooked one crucial detail. Marcus wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a way to escape the life he had, and soon, both of them would realize that neither of their illusions would survive the truth. October 27th, 2023, Tallahassee, Florida. The courthouse, an unassuming building tucked away in the corner of the city, was the stage for what could only be described as a quick and easy decision to get married. No grand ceremony, no family waiting in the wings, no celebration of a new beginning. Just two people who had no real connection other than the benefits they believed they'd gained from each other's presence. The marriage was as cold as it was swift. Eleanor stood at the front, her champagne-colored wrap dress clinging to her frame, the soft fabric an almost laughable attempt at something that might resemble a bridal gown. Marcus, ever the opportunist, stood beside her in a pair of white jeans and an open-collared shirt, as if this was just another part of his routine. No rings exchanged, no vows spoken in earnest, just a transaction waiting to unfold. They signed the papers. The deed was done. They were married, but neither of them felt it. There was no magic in the air, no excitement. There were only two people who needed something from each other and had made a quick agreement to get it. And in that moment, the only thing they both had in mind was the next step, securing what they each thought they could claim from the other. Later that night, Marcus moved into Eleanor's rental. It wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale. It wasn't a new chapter in a love story. It was a cold, calculated move. One step closer to what Marcus wanted, access to her finances, her property, the life he thought he could claim as his own. Their dinner that night was a reflection of the distance between them. Take-out sushi, the kind of food you order when you don't care enough to cook. A bottle of champagne sat unopened on the counter, its cork still pressed tight against the neck, almost mocking the idea of celebration. They ate in silence at first, the clink of chopsticks and glassware the only sound filling the space between them. Neither of them was thinking about the future. They were thinking about the next move, the next piece of the puzzle. Neither of them was speaking honestly. They were both pretending to be something they weren't. Finally, Marcus spoke. "So where's the safe?" Eleanor didn't look up from her sushi. Her eyes flickered to the bottle of champagne, then back to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. She didn't answer immediately. Marcus, sensing a hesitation, pressed further. "What about the house deed? You know the papers? I'd like to know where things stand." Eleanor's hand froze midair, holding a piece of sushi, before she slowly lowered it back to the plate. She looked at Marcus, her smile a mask of politeness, but underneath, a flicker of something more. "Irritation? Worry? That's not romantic," she said, almost too quickly. She took a sip of her wine. Then another, like the question hadn't even been asked. She changed the subject, seamlessly, effortlessly. She wasn't about to open up to him, not yet. Not when the game had just begun. But Marcus was listening. He had always been able to tell when something wasn't right. When a lie was hanging in the air, just waiting to be caught. The more she dodged, the more it told him she was hiding something. Later that night, as Eleanor turned into bed, Marcus stayed up. He told himself it was the excitement of the night that kept him awake. The newness of the situation. But deep down he knew it wasn't just that. He needed answers, and if Eleanor wasn't going to give them to him, he would have to find them himself. He began to snoop. Quietly, almost too quietly, he moved through the house. He started in the bedroom, his fingers trailing over the furniture, searching for any clue, any detail that didn't quite fit. Her jeweler box was the first thing he found. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to catch his eye. There were pieces there, some old, some new. The gold chain with the small diamond, the bracelet with the initials that didn't belong to her, things that didn't add up. But it wasn't just the jewelry that made Marcus uneasy. It was the fact that he knew nothing about her financial situation. He didn't know where she had banked, how much she owed, or even how she was affording the lifestyle she pretended to live. He opened the drawers next. Papers were scattered inside, some neatly folded, others tossed carelessly. He flipped through them quickly, scanning for anything that might give him insight into her finances. He found receipts for high-end restaurants, a bill for a rent payment that was overdue, and then a few letters from a lawyer, all dated within the last few months. He couldn't make out the details, but the red flags were everywhere. Marcus stopped, his heart racing. There was a sickening realization settling in his chest. Everything she'd told him about her wealth, about her life, about her security was a lie. The more he found, the more it all became clear. Eleanor wasn't the woman she had claimed to be. She was hiding something. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed a message to his friend. "She's ducking. I'm not stupid. She's hiding something." The message was brief, but it was everything he needed to say. The trust he had placed in her was slipping away, and now all he could think about was the truth. The truth that was slowly coming to the surface. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every turn he made, every piece of evidence he uncovered only pushed him further into doubt. The woman he had married wasn't who she said she was, and the life she had promised him wasn't real. The more Marcus thought about it, the more desperate he became. He had thought he could control the situation, but now he wasn't sure if he was in control at all. He was caught in the same web of lies he had once spun himself, and the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. As the hours dragged on, and the house remained silent, Marcus knew that the truth would eventually come out. The question was, would it be too late to fix things? Or would the lies he had been living with finally destroy everything? October 28th, 2023. The morning light filtered into the living room, casting long shadows across the floor. Marcus had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with the discoveries he had made in the dead of night. He couldn't stop thinking about the lies Eleanor had been feeding him. The jewelry, the stories of wealth, the life she had promised. None of it was real. As the sun rose, he knew it was time to face the truth. Marcus had spent the morning going through Eleanor's personal documents, a quiet anger building inside him with every new revelation. Her credit cards were maxed out, the balances were higher than he had imagined. Every statement told the same story. She was living beyond her means, stretching her finances to their breaking point. There was nothing left to keep up the facade, nothing to back the luxury she had so carefully constructed. The car leased, 2 months behind on payments. Eleanor had been driving a vehicle she couldn't afford, one that was more a symbol of status than a practical purchase. The home she had invited him into wasn't hers either. It was rented, just like the furniture, just like the life she had promised him. The jewelry, the supposed assets she had always flaunted, all of it was a lie. He dug deeper and found pawn slips, evidence of items that were no longer hers. The gold, the diamonds, all of it was gone. She had pawned it off to make ends meet, to keep up appearances. And in that moment, the rage hit Marcus like a freight train. He couldn't believe it. He had been played. He had married a woman who had nothing to offer but empty promises. He had walked into this house believing he had found the key to his escape, only to realize it was all smoke and mirrors. All that flexing and she ain't got nothing? I got played by a broke grandma. Marcus texted to his cousin, his fingers shaking as he hit send. The anger surged through him, hot and cold at the same time. The realization that he had been duped, that everything he had been led to believe was a lie, made his blood boil. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted, wasn't who she said she was. She had been manipulating him from the start, and now he was stuck with the wreckage of a lie he couldn't escape. But Marcus's rage wasn't just aimed at Eleanor. It was a rage born out of betrayal, a betrayal of everything he had been led to believe, a betrayal of the dream he had been chasing. And now, he didn't know what to do with it. The wall seemed to close in on him as he stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by her lies, trapped in a situation he had no idea how to get out of. It didn't take long before the confrontation came. Eleanor entered the room, her expression unreadable. The tension between them was thick, heavy. She could feel the shift in the air, the way Marcus was looking at her, the way his eyes burned with a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had known this moment would come. She had always known that Marcus wasn't as gullible as she'd hoped. "What's going on, Marcus?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. She could tell something was wrong, but she didn't know how deep the cracks had already formed. Without saying a word, Marcus picked up the pawn slips, holding them in front of her. His anger was palpable now, no longer hidden behind the facade of calmness he had worn for so long. "You really thought you could pull this off, huh? You really thought I wouldn't find out? I knew you were hiding something. I didn't think you were this pathetic." Eleanor's face froze for a moment. The blood drained from her cheeks as she realized what he had uncovered. For a brief second, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life managing people's perceptions, she tried to deflect. "It's not what you think, Marcus. Things got out of hand. I didn't mean to." She started, but her words were swallowed up by his growing frustration. He wasn't listening anymore. The lies, the manipulations, it had all come crashing down, and there was no way for her to fix it. Eleanor backed up slightly, her hand gripping the back of the chair behind her, as if trying to steady herself. But Marcus was already moving forward, his face twisted in anger. He threw the pawn slips on the floor between them, his voice rising. "You thought you could trap me, Eleanor. You thought I wouldn't figure this out. But guess what? I'm not some fool you can just play. I'm done with this game." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The argument escalated quickly. The neighbors, who had been going about their morning routines, started to hear the raised voices. The shouting, the harsh words, the slamming of objects. It all spilled out into the hallway. At 9:37 a.m., the first neighbor heard the commotion. The argument wasn't just verbal anymore, it was full of rage, of desperation, and something much darker. At 9:45 a.m., another neighbor, growing concerned, called 911. The dispatcher was brief, trying to get enough information to send the police. "There's a lot of shouting. Something's wrong. I think they're fighting." At 9:52 a.m., the police arrived. The front door was unlocked, but the scene they found inside was something no one had expected. The house was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that only comes after something has gone terribly wrong. The officers found Eleanor in the bathroom, her body lying motionless on the cold tile floor. The mirror above the sink had been shattered, the glass scattered like confetti across the floor. Her head had been struck with blunt force, the trauma severe. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the immediate area, no evidence of a forced entry. Meanwhile, Marcus sat on the curb outside the house, his shirt soaked with blood. His hands shook as they rested on his knees, his feet bare against the cold concrete. The scene around him was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, sirens cutting through the air, officers moving swiftly around him. His mind was racing, but his words were slow, almost childlike, as they escaped his lips. "She lied. Everything she said was a lie," Marcus whispered, the words barely audible as they trembled out. He was repeating it, almost as though he were trying to convince himself of something he knew to be true, but still couldn't fully accept. She had tricked him, played him for a fool. But now, as he sat there, covered in her blood, Marcus realized that the game had gone too far. There was no going back. The investigation began almost immediately. The police started their work, methodically going through the house, securing the crime scene. Eleanor's body had been taken away, and now, all that was left were the details. The pieces of a life that had been spun out of lies. The house, which once looked like the picture of a romantic escape, was now just the backdrop to a crime. As they moved through the living room, one of the officers spotted something that didn't sit right. The safe in the corner, slightly ajar. Marcus had mentioned it earlier in their confrontation, but he hadn't realized he had left behind such a clear trail. The officer, following his instincts, pressed the safe open. Inside, there were papers, contracts, things Marcus had left behind in his search for answers. What he had expected to find were financial documents that would lead him to more lies, but instead, there was something far more telling. Marcus's fingerprints were all over the safe. The same safe Eleanor had always kept locked. It wasn't just that Marcus had been looking for something. It was the fact that his touch had been all over it. The evidence of a forced confrontation was right there in plain sight. The police moved through the house with precision, checking every nook, every drawer, every possible hiding place. In the kitchen, they found Eleanor's phone hidden in a cabinet, just beneath a pile of unopened mail. It was an odd place to hide it, but clearly, Eleanor had wanted to keep something from Marcus. The phone buzzed, but it was silent, the screen cracked, the battery almost dead. When the officers opened it, they found a treasure trove of evidence. The messages, the pictures, the notes, all of it. It was as though Eleanor had known exactly what was coming. The first thing that stood out was a screenshot of Marcus's fake LLC. His business venture, the one he'd promised would be the key to his financial success, wasn't real. It was a shell affront. The next note was chilling. Ask him about bankruptcy. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to see on a phone belonging to someone who had just been murdered. But it told the story. Eleanor had known. She had known Marcus's secrets. She had known the truth all along. And yet, she still played the game. Then there were the pictures. One of them caught Marcus off guard. It was a photo of another man, someone she had been talking to, someone who seemed to have been part of her Plan B. The caption was simple. Plan B? The question hung in the air like a threat. Marcus wasn't just a backup in her life, he was a pawn. He had always been a pawn. But as the investigation continued, the pieces began to fit together. Eleanor, just like Marcus, had been playing the game. She had lured him in, offered him the illusion of security, and when the truth started to unravel, she had no problem taking her own steps to secure her future. She was just as manipulative as he was. The only difference? Marcus hadn't realized how far she was willing to go until it was too late. The police began to question Marcus. His initial story, full of confusion and anger, didn't add up. The more they pressed him, more holes appeared in his version of events. He had claimed to have discovered the truth about Eleanor's financial situation that morning. But he hadn't accounted for everything. The phone, the pawn slips, the clear evidence that she had been hiding things from him long before the confrontation had escalated. It was all starting to make sense. Eleanor had been trapped in a web of lies, and Marcus had been caught in it too. They had both been lying to each other, manipulating each other, pretending to be something they were not. And when the truth finally came to light, neither of them was prepared for the consequences. As the officers continued to search the house, the questions mounted. What happens when two liars fall in love and find out there's nothing left to steal? Marcus sat in the back of the police car, still shaking, his thoughts racing. He had thought he was smarter than this. He had thought he could outsmart her, get what he wanted and walk away with it. But he had been wrong. The lies he had built his life on had finally caught up to him. And now was the one paying the price. The truth was simple, really. Marcus had been for a way out of his life, but he had walked straight into another trap. Eleanor had played her part, just like he had played his. But neither of them had realized how much the game could cost. And in the end, only one of them would survive the consequences. The car pulled away, and Marcus's future, like Eleanor's, hung in the balance. By May 2024, the case had become a public spectacle. The courtroom was packed, the tension in the air thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. Marcus Elwood Cage sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of both confusion and frustration. His hands were folded in front of him, eyes vacant, as he listened to the prosecutors lay out the case. They weren't just charging him with murder. No, the charges were far more complex. They called it premeditated financial entrapment, a crime driven not just by anger, but by a desire for material gain. They painted him as a man who had married Eleanor Vance for one reason only, to secure her wealth, her property, and her life savings. The prosecutors emphasized that his discovery of her lies had been a turning point, one that ignited the violent confrontation that ultimately led to her death. The financial web they had spun, the promises of wealth that were never real, the lies told back and forth. The prosecution argued it was all part of a deliberate plan. Marcus had used Eleanor's vulnerabilities, her desperation, against her, playing on her need for validation, using her fear of abandonment to manipulate her into believing she had found love. In return, he had expected riches, access to the life she had promised but could never deliver. It was a perfect storm of deceit, with both players trapped in a game that had no way out. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They didn't deny Marcus' role in the death, but they argued that he had acted in a moment of temporary insanity. They claimed he had been emotionally manipulated by Eleanor in ways that were impossible to comprehend. His mind, they said, had been clouded by the realization that the woman he had married, the woman who had promised him everything, had been deceiving him all along. The defense contended that Marcus, in that moment, had snapped, unable to process the full scope of the betrayal. His actions, they argued, were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. The courtroom was full of whispers, eyes darting between the defendant and the prosecution. Marcus' defense attorney stood confidently, arguing that he had been a victim of Eleanor's manipulation. He was just as much a pawn in her game, a victim of her emotional deception. But the question on everyone's mind remained. Was this truly an act of passion born from betrayal, or was it the culmination of a plan that had been set in motion long before the confrontation turned deadly? The testimonies that followed painted a disturbing picture of the two people involved. Eleanor's daughter took the stand first. She spoke with the kind of pain that only years of manipulation could cause. She explained how her mother had always demanded more money, time, attention, and how they had all suffered as a result of Eleanor's need to control everything around her. But there was no love lost when she spoke about her mother. "She manipulated us our whole lives," Eleanor's daughter said, her voice trembling with emotion but steady with truth. "And then in the end she got played herself. Was never the victim in this." Her words were not just a condemnation of Eleanor's actions, but a stark reminder of how far the manipulation had gone. For years, Eleanor had spun a web of control, using guilt and emotional leverage to get what she wanted. But in the end, the very thing she had used to manipulate her children had been used against her. It wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a cycle that had been repeating itself for years. Next, Marcus's grandmother took the stand. She had raised Marcus after his mother's absence, and she had always been his protector. But even she couldn't deny the truth of his actions. He wanted love, she said, looking directly at the jury. He was looking for something he never had. But instead of finding that love, he found lies. And those lies changed him. Her words rang with sorrow. She understood Marcus better than anyone, but even she couldn't defend him. The emotional toll of growing up in a fractured home, the instability, the constant push for something more. It had all led Marcus to a place where trust was impossible. He had trusted Eleanor, but she had lied to him just as much as he had lied to her. She had promised him a life that didn't exist, and in the end, it had cost her her life. His grandmother's voice cracked as she finished, the pain of the situation too much to hide. It was clear that both of them, Marcus and Eleanor, had been trapped in a web of deceit. But the real question was whether Marcus's actions could be excused by the emotional turmoil he had endured. The prosecution painted him as a man who had taken advantage of Eleanor's vulnerabilities, exploiting her need for love and security. But the defense argued that he had been a victim too, manipulated by Eleanor's emotional control, pushed into a place of rage by the lies she had fed him. As the case continued, an expert psychologist took the stand. The criminal psychologist explained the phenomenon of mutual mirroring, a psychological concept where two people in a relationship reflect each other's behaviors, desires, and even emotional vulnerabilities, often leading them to mirror each other's deceit and manipulation. The psychologist detailed how Marcus's manipulation of Eleanor, his calculated charm, his charm that led him to believe he could outsmart her, was a reflection of the way Eleanor had used her own manipulation to keep him close. She had used her vulnerability, her loneliness, to lure Marcus in, just as he had used his charm to seduce her into thinking she was in control. The psychologist called it financial narcissism, a mindset where both parties use each other for personal gain, often hiding behind a veil of affection and love to mask their true intentions. They both played the game, the psychologist explained, but neither of them could ever win, because in relationships built on lies, there are no winners, just victims. As the psychologist spoke, the tension in the courtroom deepened. The evidence of manipulation on both sides was clear. And the question now wasn't just about who was responsible for Eleanor's death. It was about understanding how two people, so wrapped up in their own deceptions, could find themselves at the mercy of their own lies. The case wasn't just about the murder anymore. It was about the cost of living a life built on illusion. It was about two people who had lied to each other so much, they had come to believe their own lies. And when the truth finally surfaced, it was too late for either of them to escape. The courtroom fell silent as the expert's words hung in the air, leaving the jury to consider one simple question. What happens when two liars fall in love and find out there's nothing left to steal? June 17, 2024. The courtroom was full, but the air was thick with tension, every spectator waiting for the final moment. Marcus Elwood Cage sat quietly, his face set in a grim expression as the jury returned with their verdict. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his body tense. He had spent months in and out of court, listening to the arguments, hearing the evidence, and trying to hold on to some fragment of hope that he could walk away from it all. But deep down he knew the truth. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze, took his seat at the bench, the gavel in his hand. He had listened carefully to the testimonies, to the prosecution's argument of premeditated financial entrapment, to the defense's claims of temporary insanity. He had seen both sides of the story, the manipulation, the lies, the emotional turmoil that had built up over the course of months. But there was one truth that could not be ignored. Eleanor was dead, and Marcus was the one responsible for it. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cold and steady as he addressed the courtroom. The court finds the defendant, Marcus Elwood Cage, guilty of second-degree murder. The words hung in the air, a finality that crushed whatever hope Marcus had left. The audience in the courtroom shifted, murmuring under their breath, exchanging glances. Some were shocked by the conviction, others not surprised. Marcus had spent months fighting to avoid the weight of a first-degree charge, but now the truth was out. His rage, his betrayal, and his actions in that moment of violence were enough to secure a conviction. But it wasn't just the murder that had sealed his fate. It was everything that led to it. The judge continued, his voice cutting through the courtroom. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is a collision of desperation and delusion. Two people, both desperate for security, for love, for validation, and both willing to deceive each other to get it. But in the end, the lies they lived by consumed them, and a violent confrontation erupted out of a web of manipulation and broken promises. The words echoed in Marcus's mind as he sat there, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He wasn't just guilty of taking Eleanor's life. He was guilty of being part of a twisted game that neither of them could escape. The judge's words hit like a weight. Marcus hadn't realized how deep the deception had gone until it was too late. He had been desperate for a way out. But so was Eleanor. They had both been trapped in a world of lies, too proud to admit that they had been using each other. They both thought they could get what they wanted, but neither understood the price of their actions. The judge gave the final statement, his eyes scanning the courtroom one last time. Marcus Cage, you are sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder of Eleanor Vance. This court adjourns. The gavel fell, and the room went quiet. Marcus's fate was sealed. He had been sentenced not just for the crime, but for everything that had led up to it. The lies, the manipulations, the desperation. The audience in the courtroom was left to grapple with a question that lingered in the air. Was Marcus a predator or prey? The verdict didn't just settle the case for the people in the courtroom. It settled a larger question that would stay with everyone involved. Was Marcus, in the end, just another victim of Eleanor's manipulations? Did he truly snap in a moment of emotional despair? Or was he a predator, a man who had used charm and deceit to manipulate his way into a woman's life, only to snap when he didn't get what he expected? And perhaps the more unsettling question, can deception ever justify a violent reaction? Could Marcus's discovery of Eleanor's lies, her fake wealth, her deceit about her finances, the hidden pawn slips, have pushed him over the edge? Was it the betrayal? The realization that everything he had believed in was a lie that led him to kill? Or was he simply using her lies as an excuse for his own actions? In the months that followed, the case became a topic of intense debate. On one hand, there were those who saw Marcus as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been manipulated emotionally by a woman who had been playing him all along. On the other hand, there were those who believed that no matter the provocation, there was no excuse for taking someone's life. Eleanor had manipulated Marcus, yes, but in the end, It was Marcus's choice to act violently. The public couldn't seem to agree, but the question of deception remained central to the case. Were they both simply products of their own lies? Was Marcus justified in his actions, or was his rage just another form of manipulation? The debate raged on, with people across the country arguing over what Marcus had done, and whether it was something that could be understood, or if it was simply an unforgivable act of violence. But for Marcus, the truth was clear now. The lies had destroyed everything. He had thought he was escaping his old life, but in the end, he had walked straight into a trap of his own making. The game he had played with Eleanor had cost him his freedom, and now he would spend the next 2 decades reflecting on the choices he had made. Choices driven by the desperate need to escape a life of instability, but ultimately choices that led to destruction. The courtroom had spoken, the verdict was in, and Marcus Elwood Cage would spend the next 20 years in prison, paying the price for the lies that had brought him to this moment.